Chapter 1581. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:57 and 25 seconds AM. Chapter 1581. Grand display. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel closed his eyes. With his dream world now capable of projecting outside, focusing on any one thing was all too easy. This had already been proven when he went through so many years of Void Palace history in just a few seconds. Now, it once again came in handy. However, what Lionel didn't expect was for him to suddenly and so forcefully be sucked in. In fact, meditating on the Dark Star Force tablet was far easier than it ever had been with the Light Star Force tablet. Of course, the reason for this was because he hadn't awakened his starry-tailed fox's starry spirit domain back then. But that didn't make the feeling any less magical. If before Lionel could vaguely touch upon the exterior mysteries and slowly meditate on them, right this moment, he felt like he had been sucked into a vast and endless world, one no less complex than the one he was used to. And yet, all he could see in this world were three large and looming figures. The first was mysterious and ethereal. It didn't seem to have a true form and its body was a vague, uncondensed fog. However, the one portion of it that was the most prominent and powerful was its protruding tail. This tail seemed capable of crushing mountains, of splitting oceans, and shattering the skies. A single sweep encompassed the whole world. The second had wings that seemed capable of enveloping an entire planet. When it rose its head and roared into the skies, stars exploded and worlds were destroyed. Its body radiated a dark silver that sometimes shone as bright as a sun but what often as black as an endless light. The third was a grand creature of white and black. Its palms carried a strength that could choose to hold up a world or crush it. Its body was sturdy and impregnable, carrying with it a rumbling power and a towering defense. Lionel knew the names of these creatures, but he didn't quite know how to react to them being portrayed in such a grand light. The Shadow Tail. The Dusky Steel Bat. The Aurora Black Panda. These were names that he had heard from Wise Star Order, and they were the counterparts to the Snowy Star Owl, the White Stone Elephant and the Starry-Tailed Fox. This meant that the first was sixth-dimensional, and the two latter ones were seventh-dimensional, with the Aurora Black Panda being at the very pinnacle of the seventh dimension. Knowing this, it was obviously impossible for these creatures to have such strength. Splitting the skies? Destroying worlds? Shattering stars? Even eighth-dimensional creatures shouldn't have such strength unless they return to a fourth or fifth-dimensional world. If the worlds these creatures were in were indeed so weak, it would explain things. But why had they displayed themselves in such weak worlds? What was the point? And even then, how would that explain their size? The Dusky Steel Bat was quite literally able to envelop a planet with its wings. There shouldn't be a single creature with that size. Lionel's heart shuddered, suddenly remembering something. His dreamscape tried hard to spark, connecting two events that were seemingly entirely unrelated. But no matter how hard he thought, he couldn't for the life of him figure out what should bridge them. All Lionel could think of was the size of beast he had ridden to come here in the first place. And think back to the first day he awakened his Snowy Star Owl lineage factor. Back then, how majestic had the Snowy Star Owl seemed to him. With a single flap of its wings, it crossed an entire galaxy in a blink, arriving before Lionel with those caring, wise eyes just as he awakened the first of his branches. It wasn't until later that he learned that the Snowy Star Owl was actually so weak. But was it truly weak? Wasn't it just as grand as these displays here? He hadn't been conscious of the awakening of his starry-tailed fox lineage factor, but he wouldn't be surprised if it was just as grand as well. There was clearly a secret here that he didn't understand. Lionel didn't discount the possibility that this was just yet another creator of a technique blowing their own trumpet. But hadn't he spent years underestimating dimensional cleanse, before he realized that maybe its creator had actually been a bit too modest? What if this was yet another case of the same matter? I feel like I can choose. Lionel's expression flickered. With these three enormous beasts staring down at him as he stood in the depths of a void, he should have felt fear that came from the depths of his heart. But he didn't feel that at all. In fact, all he felt was familiarity, understanding, and a calmness that reached to the depths of his soul. Then ITLLBU. Lionel reached out toward the Aurora Black Panda. It was the one he understood the abilities of the most perfectly and also one he felt was very much complementary to his current starry-tailed fox lineage factor. Like Wise Star Order had said, it too had a healing branch, a strength branch and a wisdom branch, similar to the white stone elephant. However, it manifested in completely different ways. The strength branch spoke for itself, although instead of manifesting into physical changes, it instead formed a curtain of force around Lionel that displayed strength beyond relying just on Lionel's body. The healing branch acted as a life steal, taking and snatching from others to fuel it even further. And finally, the wisdom branch instead manifested as a domain, the yin-yang domain specifically, which acted as a balancer in the middle of battle. It could take the strength of an opposing force and turn it into your own, working especially well against diametrically opposed forces. However, this was just Lionel's understanding of prior to the synergy Aina spoke of. As for what it would be now, he would have to find out. Chapter 1582. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:57 and 23 seconds AM. Chapter 1582, Bloody Mist. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The Aurora Black Panda released a bellow, smashing its paws against its chest as though it wanted to let the world know that it was, indeed, the strongest. Lionel instantly felt a wild energy entering his body. It was unbridled and unruly, surging toward his deepest foundations and shredding them apart to reform them. The pain took deep roots within Lionel. He hadn't been conscious before, but this must have been something he went through previously. If it wasn't for his experience with his metal synergy lineage factor, such pain would have been enough to make him lose the will to go on entirely. Lionel immediately used Dream Sense, splitting his sensory perception and easing the load on his nerves. However, this feeling of relief only lasted for an instant before it came back even stronger than before. In the real world, Lionel involuntarily released a roar, his body cracking apart like he was carved of fragile glass. Aina's expression changed. She wanted to do something, but she held back. There was already nothing more that she could do. If she interfered now, she might actually make things worse instead of better, especially since the dense fog in the surroundings wavered and her connection with Lionel severed. He couldn't seem to maintain it anymore. Aina frowned. With a thought, another bottle of blood shattered and formed a down that enveloped Lionel. Others didn't need to see what was happening here. After she was finished, she became several times more vigilant, even forming the dome of blood into a ball that directly picked Lionel up so that she could be ready to move at any time. She might have become much stronger, but it still wasn't anywhere near enough to be casual in this place. She might be able to battle a middle fiend class demon to a standstill if it was at her tier, but high fiend class demons were beyond her, let alone a middle fiend class demon which was well beyond her in tier. Right now, her top priority was Lionel's safety. All sounds were immediately cut off, but Aina could still feel the fluctuations of Lionel's life force. They seemed to rise and fall rapidly and without a clear pattern, making it more and more difficult to tell exactly what was happening and only making her more worried. She hadn't expected this to happen to Lionel. In fact, because the synergy had been so great, she had assumed that the fusion process would be very simple. But Aina hadn't known about one very important thing. Right this moment, Lionel's body had become a warring battlefield, a clash of titans butting heads and clashing against one another again and again. However, the clash wasn't between Lionel's starry-tailed fox lineage factor and the incoming Aurora Black Panda lineage factor. Instead, it seemed to be against something entirely different, something intangible and almost unknowable. A hidden crimson energy within Lionel's body lashed out, seemingly unsatisfied with something. The arrogance it exuded was almost palpable, whipping at and crushing bits and pieces of the Aurora Black Panda lineage factor as though it was disgusting by its presence. It hammered away without a care for Lionel's well-being, pushing again and splintering it into bits and pieces. These bits and pieces scrambled to survive, pushing out against Lionel's body and causing his skin to splinter and break, a rain of blood flooding out from his body. However, it was then that something quite magical happened. The Aurora Black Panda lineage factor began to find shelter in the depths of Lionel's starry-tailed fox lineage factor. The further it was broken down, the more the two ingratiated into one another. Although they were still separate, their union was far more cohesive, and the large leaps Lionel's strength was taking only grew larger. The crimson energy still looked down disdainfully, but when it wanted to lash out more, it found that there was nothing remaining to lash out against. And, for some reason or another, it didn't seem to have the same control over Lionel's starry-tailed fox lineage factor. At that moment, Lionel's aura erupted in a valiant pillar of dark gold, shattering even Aina's blood sphere. The image of a panda enveloped Lionel, but it looked completely different from what it should have been. Its white fur was almost blinding, to the point where it was almost impossible to look it directly. At the same time, its once black fur had become a radiant dark gold that wafted a dark aura. However, this was the most minor of the changes. The panda had gained a third eye, one that was placed right upon its forehead. Very quickly, though, it became clear that this was just the first of 7 total it would gain. Somehow, the panda now had 3 heads, each one with 3 eyes of its own. At the same time, it had gained 2 more pairs of arms, giving it a total of 6 limbs, not including its feet. Its aura was incomparably majestic, its large belly and radiant dark gold body making it look like a Buddha incarnate. Just its presence alone made the space around it tremble. Those that laid eyes on it would feel the desire to prostrate themselves and commit themselves to a life of servitude. Lionel, who was hovering within its illusory chest, still didn't seem to have realized what was going on around him, his eyes still closed. However, what was astounding was that his bronze runes, which had been slowly thickening, now radiated a color far more dark gold than it was bronze. At the same time, his pale violet hair danced with a subtle light of its own, the crown on his forehead and the halo above his head trembling with a powerful majesty. When Lionel's eyes opened, a beam of light split the space before him, a strong ripple of spatial force incomparably more powerful than his previous force ripping it to shreds. Lionel's gaze shifted, only to find that Aina was battling to keep him protected. She was holding her own, but when the sphere of blood had shattered, she had lost her mobility. Lionel's brow furrowed. Another middle fiend-class demon? Die. The dark gold panda raised one of its size palms, slamming down with a mighty aura. Bang! The wind pressure of the strike alone, long before the palm hit the ground, shattered the fiend-class demon into a bloody mist. Chapter 1583. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:57 and 22 seconds AM. Chapter 1583. Grin. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Aina's brows shot up. For a moment, she thought that another enemy had come. But it wasn't long before she realized that it wasn't a stranger at all, but rather Lionel. She couldn't help but stare for a while. Although she knew that whatever changes Lionel underwent would be explosive since her own was already so great, but even this was outside her expectation. This change was more than just explosive, it was even a bit difficult to accept. The dark gold panda Lionel sat within was at least 10 meters tall, dwarfing even many of the demons they had come across. But what was truly fearsome was the amount of condensed power it exuded. That palm just now wasn't a physical attack, it was a compression of force, extremely dense force. If Aina was correct, that force should be Aurora Star Force, a fusion of Earth, Star and Dark Force only second to Chaotic Particle Force. Though, this alone wasn't enough to paint the picture because forces that fused the 3 were too rare, one would be hard-pressed to name 5 of them, so the fact that this was second didn't mean much. However, its power alone spoke for itself. Aurora Star Force was unlike most Earth forces because it was especially powerful in control and applications of gravity. In this way, it was a lot more like a spatial force than it was an Earth force. The difference, however, lay in the fact that rather than twisting space to achieve its results directly, it, instead, concentrated a large amount of weight into a small point. These principles were the core behind what generated the yin-yang domain of the Aurora Black Bear, as well as the gravity of Aurora Star Force was the core of what powered the balancing abilities of the yin-yang domain. In truth, Aurora Star Force was no more powerful than Ethereal Star Force was. One was a mixture of Earth, Star, and darkness, while the other was a mixture of space, star and light. They were both top 100 in their respective light and dark categories, making them very powerful considering the rarity of light and dark force. However, for some reason, Lionel's Aurora Star Force seemed much stronger now than his ethereal Star Force had ever been. That said, Lionel was thinking about any of this right now. In fact, his mind wasn't even very focused on the attack he had just levied either. At this moment, he was simply basking in a magical sort of feeling, and his mind was being commanded by a single thought. With the yin-yang domain as a foundation, was it even possible for anyone in the sixth dimension to defeat his current self? The last time Lionel had gained an ability this useful, it had come in the form of a spear domain. His duality spear had allowed him to use his mind and calculative abilities to close the gap between himself, who had been at tier 1 of the fifth dimension back then, and an entire group of sixth-dimensional existences. Unfortunately, because of the formation of his seventh star upon entering the tier 3, his duality spear was destroyed and wasn't able to be repaired by the spear domain heirloom. The duality spear was simply the perfect match for his ability index. Alone, Lionel's ability index was simply too weak in direct combat. But when it was paired with external abilities that could amplify it and allow it to shine, it was akin to slapping wings on his back and allowing him to soar through the skies. It felt to Lionel that the yin-yang domain was another such opportunity. In fact, it was far more powerful than duality domain ever had been. Lionel had self-created only one technique in his lifetime, but it was so powerful that even to this day, it was one of his strongest trump cards, so much so that he rarely brought it out. Of course, this was in part due to the fact that he hadn't gotten a chance to experience the techniques of the Void Palace yet because he had spent so much time running around. But today, he would create a second. You'll no longer be called yin-yang domain. I'll call you Lotus domain from now on. The ferocious expressions of the three-headed panda construct suddenly became docile and serene. 6 hands rose into the air, each palming orbs of sparkling dark gold energy. But very quickly, this energy began to rotate and change shape, eventually becoming dark gold lotuses with hundreds to thousands of petals each. These lotuses were soft and gentle, formed by Aurora Star Force and dazzling beneath the dim lights of the demon world. Aside from being beautiful, these 6 lotuses didn't seem to have any other abilities. Still, for some reason, Lionel looked very much satisfied as he forced them to vanish. Calm returned to him and the 10-meter-tall construct vanished with an exhale of his breath. He smiled toward Aina, very much glad that he had listened to her. If not, then who knew how long it would have taken him to make this leap? This demon world was such a grand treasure trove. Wouldn't it be too unfortunate if he could take advantage of it because he was too weak? Lionel still wasn't confident in claiming the top prize of this sector, but at this point, that wasn't his main goal. What he wanted to do was to collect as many demon corpses as he could before this event came to an end. Then once they left this place, the foundation he would have to build up the foundations of his allies and prepare for the air wars would maybe be beyond even that of his elder cousins. Also, with such a large selection of demons here, he didn't believe that he wouldn't be able to collect enough samples for when he finally reconnected with the segmented cube and gained access to the tentacle womb once again. While he might not have strength to dominate the fiend class sector, he most definitely had the strength and intelligence combination he needed to scrounge up more resources than he knew what to do with. He couldn't help but sweep Aina into his arms, a bright grin on his face. Chapter 1584. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:57 and 20 seconds AM. Chapter 1584, 9th day. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. So you've learned our lesson now? Aina smugly met Lionel's gaze after the two finally decided to come up for air. My lesson? Lionel could immediately guess at what Aina was talking about, but for the sake of his pride, he feigned ignorance, preparing the best line he could to shift the topic to the weather. Unfortunately, Aina caught on long before he could say anything. No. I want to hear it. Say it loud and clear. My name is Lionel Morales, and my girlfriend's ideas are better than my own. Lionel coughed. This was clearly a case of giving an inch and taking a mile. She truly was ruthless, but on the flip side, she had a point. Ultimately, Lionel had blind spots Aina was often able to cover. It wasn't wrong of her to ask him to run more things by her. At the same time, this was a bit of a special case since it literally required her to swallow dozens of liters of his blood, a loss he wouldn't have even been able to sustain if not for instant recovery, being active. Regardless, though, at least in this case, she was definitely correct. Alright, you win. I concede defeat. Aina blinked, perking her ears up. About? Being the most handsome man in the world, Lionel sighed. It's a heavy burden to carry. Aina laughed, shaking her head. Clearly, this was the greatest concession she was going to get out of this blockhead. But she would take this small victory. Let's go. We probably have a few weeks to maybe a couple months to gather up as many demons as we can, not to mention make it to the exchange so that we can get the final ingredient. We can't waste even the smallest bit of time. Aina nodded. Now that Lionel had so much strength, their best bet was to maximize it. Since Lionel had a method to leave this zone, they should be thinking ahead to the future. If the Void Palace could monopolize this zone, it would be a huge game changer. The demon race of this world was simply far too valuable in how great of an effect their corpses could have on human development. Even with his explosive increase in power, Lionel still gained enormously from Force Pill Aina crafted from the Tier 3 strength-based middle fiend class demon. This was because the strength of the Aurora Black Panda didn't come from its body, but rather a specific application of its force. What Lionel had come to realize that the dividing line between the Light Star Force and the Dark Star Force sides of his lineage factor was in the fact that the former focused internally while the latter was far more external. The speed branch of the Snowy Star Owl, for example, lowered Lionel's weight to make him faster. The wisdom branch of the Starry-Tailed Fox expanded Lionel's mind and ethereal glabella. The strength branch of the White Stone Elephant ballooned Miguel's muscles and strength. However, with the Dark Star Forces, it was the opposite. The wisdom branch manifested externally as a domain. The healing branch functions like a life steal ability index. The strength branch actually formed a beast construct that Lionel could take control of to power his attacks. They were like two sides of the same coins. They often had similar end goals, but they reached them using different methods, and this made their synergy all the greater. This was all to say that while Lionel had experienced an explosive growth in his strength, the fundamental changes to his foundation were actually quite small. In fact, because of the sudden growth in his potential, the holes in his foundation actually became much larger. As such, he needed more demon corpses to make up for what he was lacking. Surprisingly, this allowed Lionel to refine Aina's pills even faster. And since the both of them were much stronger and could target more powerful demons, there were more to pick from, which resulted in them finding more and more than were beneficial for them. In just a single week, Lionel and Aina easily reached a point where they were 2 or even 3 times stronger than they had been when they first stepped foot into the Fiend class sector. On top of that, their store of demons only seemed to pile up higher and higher. Just a single one of these demons would be enough to change the fate of an ordinary talent into a genius worthy of entering the Void Palace, and that was just the lower Fiend class ones. Lionel and Aina didn't even bother to absorb any at that level anymore, focusing entirely on the middle Fiend class. Their strength improved by leaps and bounds and their battles only became easier. On the 9th day, Lionel came to a pause. I found one. It's already headed in this direction. Higher Fiend class demons are really something else. Lionel informed Aina immediately. Although he could use the Starry Star domain to confuse the demon like he usually did and avoid it, he felt that he and Aina were ready to face a higher Fiend class demon head on this time. Tier 2 higher Fiend class demon. It should be a good battle, but our lives won't be in danger. It'll be good to see where my limits lay now. I'll take the vanguard now, you support me from the back. As Lionel spoke, a 3-headed, 6-armed, dark gold panda construct enveloped him, rising to its feet with a booming momentum. A higher Fiend class strength-based demon shot through the thick fog, appearing just meters away. Lionel took a breath. His yin-yang domain was useless against a pure strength-based demon, and it had become his greatest reliance recently. However, he was still confident. His panda construct roared, its 6 palms jetting out like streaking bullets to meet the higher Fiend class demon head-on. Chapter 1585. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:57 and 18 seconds AM Chapter 1585, Invincible if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The demon was enormous, standing just as tall as Lionel's panda construct. Its eyes were nothing more than two orbs of pulsing black flames and its body was covered from head to toe in thick, shiny, black scales. It had a tail half the height of its already ridiculously tall body, but other than this, it was perfectly humanoid, even down to its human-like face despite it being covered in those radiant black scales. When its palms met Lionel's, they were evenly matched for just a moment before Lionel's third, fourth, fifth and sixth arms collided against its solid cheek, sending it spiraling backward. Deep indents appeared on its torso, Lionel's aurora star force leaving devastating impacts in its wake. The collision was so powerful that the demon almost fell down, its balance having nearly been taken away from it. This was a shocking matter for high-level warriors, especially a strength-based one like the demon. Their coordination, their dexterity, and their balance was what most of their strength relied upon. Such a mistake wasn't something that would happen, and yet it just had. Despite this, Lionel wasn't satisfied. This construct was powerful, but the reason he had yet to simply shift to purely targeting higher fiend-class demons was because it was also greatly restrictive. He wasn't used to having 6 arms, and he hadn't grasped enough of the mysteries of this lineage factor to even understand what he was supposed to do with 3 heads. He didn't even need the extra vision when his starry spirit domain was already so powerful in this aspect. Maybe the most obvious issue was its size. All of his spears had suddenly become useless, and so did his bow. What made it all worth the exchange was his lotus domain, but that was most effective against those that relied on an external use of force. As such, it was useless against a demon like this one who relied on nothing other than its pure physical strength. Despite his frowning, Lionel continued to unleash a relentless barrage. To his back, Aina waited patiently for an opening, ready to strike at any moment. This is the problem with getting new and shiny abilities. They're so much more powerful, but because I don't have the accompanying techniques and can only rely on myself, I also regress in a lot of ways. This was what Lionel feared when he upgraded his lineage factors. This would almost always be a problem. He was just lucky to have spontaneously had the accumulated knowledge to form his lotus domain, but now that it was useless, his power took a dip. No, I'm likely missing something. I didn't just gain the Aurora Black Panda lineage factor, but I felt it fuse with my starry-tailed fox lineage factor. In fact, the reason this construct has 3 heads and 3 pairs of arms in the first place is because the starry-tailed fox's strength is linked to its 3 tails. Lionel hadn't had a difficult fight in the last 9 days, but as he fought this higher fiend-class demon, trying to search for a path toward victory, his mind began to deduce and piece certain things together. If they were fused, did that mean that there were changes to his starry domains? He hadn't sensed any, but maybe that was because he hadn't looked hard enough. Lionel used his middle pair of arms to lock the demon's own arms in place, his lower pair of arms to make a strong sweep at the back of its kneecaps, and his upper pair arms to wrap strongly around its back. He roared, ripping the demon off of its feet and arching his back. Bang! The higher fiend-class demon's neck snapped with an audible and sickening crack, its tough scales unable to save it from such a fate. However, when Lionel released and rolled over, the demon unleashed a roar of its own, standing up even with its head bent at an awkward angle. Lionel's eyes narrowed. The vitality of demons were exceptional, and only became more trouble against strength-based demons. In fact, compared to the lower-class demons, they only became more and more fearsome with every step forward. Lionel had been able to kill a lower fiend-class demon with a hole in the chest, but they had to split the skulls of middle fiend-class demons to kill them, and this higher fiend-class demon was just fine even after its spine was broken. It would clearly be far more involved to kill this one, and Lionel couldn't imagine how much it would take to kill a chaos-class demon. It seemed that he would need to bring out his starlit star force. Only high-quality force of higher dimensions could stop this sort of quick healing. The higher fiend-class demon snapped its neck back into place, its tail suddenly lashing out like a vicious whip. Its speed was impossibly fast, too fast for Lionel to react to normally. Lionel subconsciously tried to use his starry light domain to escape. He had already had the idea of testing out the new secrets of his domains at the forefront of his mind, so he chose to try this out first. A light enveloped his enormous panda construct, shifting him back just 10 meters in less than a fraction of a second. The tail whipped by, leaving a streak of trembling space in its wake as though any more energy would rip through the fabric of reality. That feeling, Lionel's heart skipped a beat. Yes, that tail strike was powerful and would have probably shattered his panda construct, but that wasn't what had shocked him. In that moment, he faintly felt his ethereal star force and aurora star force fusing into one before seamlessly separating. It made sense. His dark gold panda construct was formed of aurora star force, and his starry light domain used ethereal star force. If he wanted to move one through the latter, they would need to fuse for a time. Lionel's eyes glowed like two blazing torches. He flipped over a palm, a spear covered in white gold hexagonal scales appearing in his hand. At the same time, his starry light domain bloomed to life, fusing with his yin-yang domain and surging with aurora star force. Lionel's panda construct reached out a palm, dark gold and white gold energy forming a spiraling cyclone around it before an illusory and vibrant reconstruction of his spear appeared. This one, however, rather than being 2.5 meters tall, was just over 12 meters tall. Lionel laughed, his spear swinging out casually. A wild wind shot out in all directions, forming a tsunami of force that sent the higher fiend-class demon stumbling backward. Lionel's eyes glowed with confidence. His lineage factor was called the spear domain lineage factor for a reason. The core of his spear essence wasn't in the spear itself, but rather in the domain it represented. That was where all of its strength came from. If Lionel's starry light domain could fuse with his yin-yang domain, then why couldn't the latter also fuse with his starry spirit domain? The starry spirit domain was ultimately a representation of Lionel's dream world, and Lionel's dream world was a projection of his abilities. He could use his dream world as a medium to project the core essence of the spear in his hand to his yin-yang domain by fusing them into one, then he could use aurora star force to give it life. The yin-yang domain was, in the first place, designed to take a force of one kind and turn into a force of the exact opposite kind. So what if you took dream force and forced it to become its direct opposite? Wouldn't you go from something that was purely a construct of your mind, to something that was tangible and real? Lionel struck forward with a mighty momentum, his laughter ringing throughout the demon world and echoed long after his spear ran through the high fiend-class demons' hearts. He felt invincible. Chapter 1586. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:57 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1586. Hardly if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. An unruly amount of power trembled in Lionel's palm, almost to the point that it intoxicated him. He could already see several flaws with this ability, but none of it seemed to matter right this moment. Right here and now, he felt more powerful than he had ever been before. Lionel took deep breaths, quickly calming himself and allowing his thoughts to flow smoothly. When his heartbeat had returned to a manageable rhythm, he looked down at the spear his dark gold panda construct was wielding. It looked absolutely identical to the spear that he was wielding in its true hand, with only the caveat that it was somewhat illusory. It looked no different from a projection of Lionel's dream world, and yet it was able to interact with the world and display might no less than that of his spear. In fact, it was even faintly beyond because it was built with the core essence of the spear domain in mind. After Lionel broke through the 6th dimension and raised his dream force to the pinnacle of the 7th dimension, the rising difficulty he had faced traveling through the spear domain world barely had an impact on him any longer. In fact, while before it had been difficult for him to reach this quasi-gold spear, right now, he could pick from a selection of tens of thousands of them with absolute ease. It was no further than a thought away for him. That said, he had yet to truly master the spear because he hadn't had the time to digest the teaching of the spears that surrounded its spear peak. As such, Lionel had yet to get a grasp for its domain and how it would be used. In fact, he didn't even know the name of the spear yet. And yet, despite all of this, using his spear domain lineage factor, linking it with his dream world by proxy of his starry spirit domain, and then using the fusion of his light star and dark star lineage factors to combine his starry spirit domain with his yin-yang domain, he was able to unearth the true essence of the spear in his hand and manifest it. This created a spear construct with a deadly amount of power, tapping into a level of strength Lionel shouldn't have been able to use just yet because he had yet to truly master this spear. When Lionel found the time to truly master this spear and bring out even more of its strength, the construct would only become more powerful. The shocking thing about all of this was that because Lionel couldn't quickly and fully comprehend the spear in his hand unlike he could most everything else that entered his starry spirit domain. This meant that Lionel didn't have a completed dream sculpt for the spear, and as such, didn't have a perfect representation for it. The meaning here was the only reason why this spear was illusory and not solid should be because Lionel couldn't manifest its true form. Since the Dream Force version was incomplete, the opposing force used to construct it, a force Lionel wasn't even sure had a name, would likewise be incomplete. That meant, Lionel's palm flipped over, his foggy black bow appearing in his free hand. In just a few seconds, a complete construction of the silver-grade bow was completed in his mind and a perfect dream sculpt appeared in his dream world. A rush of aurora force flooded forth and space quaked and struggled. Bang! A rush of violent force charged through, manifesting a bow that stood 15 meters tall from tip to curved tip. The dark gold panda construct trembled, hoisting the bow up. Lionel used 2 hands to hold onto his spear and 4 to hold up and draw his bow. Wild winds fluctuated in the surroundings, a violent tempest of force surging forth. Because the bow is so much bigger, the force arts used to forge it are also much larger and much more robust. So, the amount of force it can gather in forming an arrow is on an exponentially larger scale. If I fully draw this bow, Lionel wanted to test it, but he forced himself to stop. The only reason he had started this was to test something. There was no way that such an ability didn't come without a price, and there definitely was one. But after paying keen attention to his body, Lionel found that he was in a unique position to deal with the drawbacks. First, there was the creation of the construct. When Lionel's dream force was converted to what he could only call construct force for now, it used aurora force to power the yin-yang domain, but the formation of the actual construct was a lot like the dream force used in the construction of zones. The difference here was that while that dream force was just an illusion, construct force demanded something real. The good news was that because of his metal synergy lineage factor, Lionel was in an extremely unique position to very easily supply the yin-yang domain with exactly what he needed. It had to be remembered that thanks to his metal body, Lionel could manifest the ores he had absorbed into his foundation in real life. That was because he had reference points to draw perfect reconstructions of them. But now that his dream world could manifest materials into reality, the burden shifted from his metal body to his dream sculpts. This meant that anything Lionel could perfectly reconstruct, so long as it was related to a force he had great control over, he would likewise be able to manifest it. And since he had such a high affinity for variant earth force, there were very few treasures, weapons and armors that he wouldn't be able to perfectly reconstruct. However, there were drawbacks as well. This bow in particular only had a metal body, but its bowstring was actually formed of a beast's tendons, maybe even a demon's tendons. As such, when Lionel manifested it into reality, not only was at least 10% of his stamina used up despite it being a 6-dimensional construct, but the bowstring was still somewhat illusory, a lot like his spear. It could be used, but it would contain its true power. Still, the explosive increase in strength was so much thanks to its upgrade in size that this loss hardly mattered. Chapter 1587. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:57 and 14 seconds AM. Chapter 1587. Absolutely not. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. This trade-off was so minuscule that Lionel didn't waste a single drop of sweat fretting over it. He knew that there would be this kind of drawback the moment he attempted to use this ability. The yin-yang domain was so effective against him when he fought that 3-finger cult woman precisely because he used light force and they used dark force. The conversion was especially easy because it transferred precisely over to a force they had great control over. Although they could still use the domain against him if he used a different sort of force, the burden would have been greater. This was ultimately why the Aurora Black Panda was still a top 7th-dimensional beast and not some mythical 9th-dimensional monster. Even with this being the case, as unwilling as Lionel was to improve his lineage factors before, right now, he was even more unwilling. Giving up his starry spirit domain was already a huge barrier for him to cross, but now that he could fuse it with his yin-yang domain and use it like this, Would he be a fool to try and chase after greater power right now? He already knew the next two lineage factors for both halves. On the light star half, there was still the twinkling light bear and the golden tiger. On the dark star half, there was the crimson clawed ape and the death pulse deer. According to Y's star order, there was also a sixth for each to complete the 12 sides. But he had no idea what they were. What he did know, though, was that he simply had no intention of even considering upgrading to these unless they could prove themselves to be more useful than this combination. If before Lionel didn't think anyone of the human domain's sixth dimension could defeat his current self. Right now, he might even be willing to try battling someone in the seventh dimension to truly see where his limits lied. Of course, this was just for the human domain. In this weird zone, he didn't dare to get too cocky. The power levels of those in this zone clearly far outstripped anything Lionel had become used to in the human domain, which was why he still made a conscious effort to hide his abilities. Lionel took a breath and finally fully settled down. The palms of his dark gold panda construct squeezed and his bow and spear vanished. Oh! Lionel's eyes lit up. He just realized that using his Dream Force stars, he could actually reverse the transformation and reabsorb some of the force he had used. Although he could only seem to regain about 70%, this was another great discovery. Lionel turned toward Aina and grinned. Impressive, right? Aina was speechless for a moment, truly speechless. Did you break into Tier 5? Aina wasn't wrong for being so shocked. It should have been impossible for anyone to enter the savant level. It was a barrier that couldn't be crossed no matter what. However, she had just witnessed Lionel form something with his dream force, did she not? There was simply no faking this. Lionel laughed. No, I didn't. But I found a method to effectively do just that. Unfortunately, unlike savants who don't have to waste any stamina whatsoever, I have to use up a lot, so I can't just casually do it. That said, Lionel flipped over a palm and a dancing force art appeared. It took no more than the blink of an eye, impossibly quick, so quick that Aina couldn't even track it being drawn. But that was precisely the point. Lionel hadn't drawn it. He had had this force art in his dream sculpts for a very long time. Although he rarely used it anymore, with the speed of his mind, it would be foolish if he didn't split at least some of his attention toward comprehending more of Camelot's magic system. From time to time, he would grasp something new and he would store it into his dream world. Camelot's magic system was too useful to him. After all, it should be remembered that one of his most powerful trump cards, Star Fusion, was a result of comprehending the knighthood aspects of Camelot's magic system. This force art, however, was related to the path of a mage. You see this? I can make them appear within my starry spirit domain whenever I want. The trouble is that in the past, even if I used them as a template, it would still take time to cast in battle. Unless I was using Dream Class and tempering myself as a mage, it's often just easier to use my spear or my bow. The trade-off isn't worth it. But now, Lionel snapped his fingers and the force art in his palm vanished. However, the moment it did, dozens of identical illusory force arts appeared all around, each just as perfect as the last without even the slightest variation. And then, Lionel's yin-yang domain appeared and everything changed. In one instant, the force arts were illusory, but in the next, they were converted to construct force and gained life. They blazed with a fiery fire force, becoming dozens of roaring flood dragons that spiraled about Lionel's body. Right now, Lionel could accomplish something even beyond instant casting. The moment the thought formed in his head, the spell could be formed. Not only that, but the spell could dance between reality and illusion as Lionel pleased, catching enemies off guard, slipping through defenses, and erupting with force at the most unexpected times. When Lionel said that he almost felt invincible, he was exaggerating in the slightest. With the way he battled, and with this number of trump cards on hand, he was hard-pressed to believe that anyone near his strength level had even the smallest chance at defeating him. Maybe they might exist in this zone, and maybe even in the other domains of the dimensional verse. But in the human domain? Absolutely not. Chapter 1588. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:57 and 12 seconds AM Chapter 1588. So far and distant. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again in the blink of an eye. Lionel had suddenly left Aina far behind. However, she had a bright smile on her face and didn't seem fazed by it in the slightest. She was quite happy and content if Lionel was stronger than her, not because she wanted to be protected, but because it would be easier for him to protect himself. That way, she would have less to worry about when it came to him. At the same time, though, it lit a fire within her. Knowing Lionel, if she fell too far behind, he would use it as an excuse to keep her out of the loop. That was something that she couldn't allow. But this was a good opportunity too. Since you're so big and powerful now, I can officially be the passenger princess I was always meant to be. Let me ride on your shoulders. I want to meditate on the Blood Sovereign tablet. Lionel laughed. Aina wanted to be a passenger princess? As if he would ever believe something like that. It was more likely that the final thing she said was what she truly wanted to do. Now that she didn't need to worry about Lionel anymore, she could take some time to grow stronger. As of right now, it wasn't a top priority to refine the demon corpses instantly. Aside from pausing to refine the force pills she and Lionel would consume immediately, she wouldn't need to pause her meditation at all. You don't have to ride on my shoulder, you can ride inside with me. I have absolute control over the gravity inside the panda construct. I can probably extend that outside too, but the trade-off in stamina drain usually isn't worth it. Aina's eyes lit up. That was even better. She dispersed her blood armor, only to suddenly remember that she was half naked. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for one man's eyes in particular, it was already too late. Lionel blinked, his eyes roaming. My eyes are up here, Aina said with a cough. I know where they are. Lionel mumbled, somewhat out of it. Aina giggled before covering her chest with her arms. How about you make me something to wear with that new ability of yours? Ah, right. Lionel shook his head, his eyes becoming clearer. I don't think I can do that. Another difference between the Tier 5 ability index and what I can do is that my constructs are not permanent, they only last for as long as I sustain my yin-yang domain. But, I think I have a workaround. Probably, it's a bit of a work in progress, but I think it should probably be possible if I manage to do a few things. Aina nodded, understanding. There had to be some drawbacks. Copying the abilities of a savant couldn't come without certain costs. It was unfortunate that little Tali wasn't here, because then Lionel could just make new clothes for Aina. Neither of them seemed to have come with an extra pair. In fact, right now, he still had a huge hole in his pants from where she had ripped it. But luckily, it was quite easy to hide since they were so baggy to begin with. Just a few binding lines of thin metal were enough. But Lionel couldn't just allow Aina to walk around like this, he definitely wasn't willing. Easy enough. Lionel reached a hand forward and placed a palm on Aina's breast, not the one that was exposed to the air, but rather the one still hidden behind her leather and plate armor. As the foundation of his metal body was improved and strengthened, he also felt that his control over the earth force had increased as well, especially toward variant earth force and metals. Although his ability to mold them to his will wasn't as great as when he had little Tali by his side, it STLL wasn't too bad. The plate armor that had covered Aina's chest thinned and began to spread, stretching across her body and forming a band around her chest. Lionel continued to manipulate the bits and pieces of metal that were left just like this, and when he ran out, he even manifested some fifth-dimension star core to fill in the gaps. The end result was a half-fabric, half-metal bodysuit that covered and suited her quite well. Aina smiled. Perfect. Lionel nodded, sweeping her up into his arms and forming the panda construct once again. Aina sank into his lap and had already shut her eyes. Lionel was already more comfortable than any seat she had ever sat upon, and her trust in him didn't need to be explained, so she almost instantly sunk into a state of meditation. With a wave of his hand, caused the force pill Aina had concocted to shoot upward and into his panda construct's palm. This should be what remained of the high fiend-class demon's corpse. Aina must have refined it while he was testing out his new abilities one by one. As usual, it was extremely heavy, but it might as well have been as light as a feather in the hands of Lionel's construct. She left it for me. Lionel smiled lightly, looking down at Aina, who had already taken his chest as a pillow and his thighs as arm rests. In fact, before she closed her eyes, she even made him wrap an arm around her like a true passenger princess. Lionel felt a calmness in his heart right now. Those days of him willingly giving her up felt so far and distant. And for a moment, he felt a sinking feeling that he would never be able to do that again. He didn't even know how he had managed the first time. The more powerful he became, the stronger the pull became, the more impossible it was for him to escape it. He just couldn't leave her side. Somehow, though, this so-called sinking feeling only made her heart lighter and the path ahead all the brighter. Lionel lightly touched against the barrier of the natural light realm, although for now, it was too vague for him to even sense. This was the natural light realm of the dimensional verse. But rather, the natural light realm of this zone. Lionel wrapped his arms slightly tighter around Aina's waist, as though to reassure her that he was here, and that he would never leave again. With the other hand, he swallowed the high fiend class pill, allowing it to crash into his stomach like a mountain colliding with a tranquil lake. A rush of strength poured into his body, his bronze runes lighting up once again and quickly beginning to grow in size once more. When the process was finished, Lionel's bronze runes had grown so thick that they no longer looked like runes. In fact, because they were so thick, it felt like Lionel's skin had become the runes instead. Just a tiny sliver away, but it feels like such an enormous canyon to leap over. Even a high fiend class tier 2 demon wasn't enough. Lionel relaxed as he felt his metal body plummet down once again to tier 4. It had fallen from the pinnacle of the 5th dimension down 5 entire tiers, and yet it wasn't satisfied yet. Lionel smiled. Let's go on a bit of a rampage, then. The panda construct charged, but not a single sound made it in as Aina seemed to continue to sleep in absolute tranquility. By this point, though, Lionel's point totals had begun jumping with enough regularity that others had taken notice. Chapter 1589. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:57 and 9 seconds AM. Chapter 1589. Gremlin. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Nothing could escape Lionel. Now that his mind had the support of real strength, his speed of killing demons was on a completely different level. While most had to wait patiently or attract demons over to them, Lionel could blanket dozens of kilometers with his internal sight and 10 with his dream world. There was simply nothing that could hide from him. Every time he found a proper target, he was a single starry light domain use away from appearing right before them, and since he chose his targets so perfectly, most didn't last more than just a few exchanges. To the current Lionel, lower fiend class demons up to tier 7 were no problem at all. The same was the case for tier 4 middle fiend class demons and tier 1 higher fiend class demons. Of course, these were pure strength-based demons he was referring to. For demons that relied heavily on the elements, he could push his easy victories much further. In addition, if he was willing to enter a long, protracted battle, he could go a tier or 2 upward without quite putting his life on the line. The more he battled, the more fluid his battle style became and the more powerful his control over his domains began. Switching between them, overlapping them and fusing them became as easy as breathing. His Lotus domain, an evolved self-created method he had formed to use his Yin-Yang domain, only seemed to become more and more powerful. Even when he faced creatures he couldn't easily convert because he lacked the opposing affinity, he still managed to learn and quickly grasp new methods. 2 of Lionel's dark gold panda construct's arms wielded a spear with fierce precision. In his 4 remaining arms, he held up 4 sparkling lotuses, each rotating with a mysterious sort of delicate energy. They looked gentle, ethereal, and beautiful, as though they had no place on such a bloody battlefield. Cyclones and wild bursts of lightning rushed toward Lionel from all sides. However, every time one shot forward, Lionel's spear would meet it, severing it in 2 with a savage sharpness. Amidst the storm, Lionel's panda construct was solid and sturdy. Sparks of lightning claws at the ground around him like the strikes of a venomous devil, and yet none of them touched even the hem of his clothing. Lionel's gaze flashed with a cold light. In that moment, the lotuses he held up began to shift and change, becoming more complex. Lionel's panda construct took a step forward, striking out hard with one of his lotus-wielding palms. At that moment, a cyclone of lightning and a fragile lotus met. And yet, what actually happened was completely out of the expectations of anyone who might have been observing. As though sucked in by a black hole, the lightning swirled into the body of the lotus. Just when the demon Lionel couldn't even see with his own eyes wanted to follow up with a second attack, Lionel's second lotus-wielding palm shot forward, sucking up the attack just as easily as the first. The twin pair of lotuses vibrated with a wild energy, fluctuating from their dark bronze ambrosia-like color to something far more cloudy and thunderous. At the same time, the two remaining unused lotuses were brought together as the panda construct's fifth and sixth hands clasped together lightly. The moment they did, the lotuses fused and bloomed. With a quick, yet gentle momentum, a large lotus appeared around Lionel, rotating slowly as it sapped up every instance of lightning force in the region. The demon suddenly found itself completely unable even to gather force from the surroundings. One of the forces that Lionel had trouble breaking down with his lotus domain was precisely lightning force. He had no innate affinity for it, or its opposite, so every time he faced such a demon, he had to calculate it all from scratch. This was practically the only thing that could slow his lotus domain down. He could use his yin-yang domain to forcefully refine the lightning force anyway, as that was what it was designed to do. However, if Lionel applied his comprehensions of the lotus he had gained from that research paper, he found that he could use a fraction of the stamina necessary to receive results that were far better and many times more potent. The yin-yang domain was supposed to be a last resort trump card that sapped up a ton of energy. But Lionel had managed to turn it into a casual technique that was of no burden to himself whatsoever. In fact, it was such a non-burden that once it was deployed perfectly, Lionel could toy with an enemy elemental demon as though it was nothing more than a child. The moment his calculations were finished, all of the demon's useful force was sapped away, revealing its true form. It had a cloud covering its lower body and its upper half was covered in stone and metal. It looked like a little gray-skinned gremlin, but its power output was so great that it was easily classified as a Tier 5 middle fiend class demon. The gremlin demon screeched, sweeping forward its bony and much too long fingers across the air to form more curtains of lightning. But as quickly as the new lightning streaks formed, Lionel's lotuses rotated and sucked it all away. This is... Lionel's brows rose. To Lionel's surprise, the direct opposite of lightning force was an odd vibrational force. Just its presence alone made the air quake, and if he used it to attack, Lionel struck forward with one of the two palm lotuses he hadn't deployed into a larger form. The gremlin demon screeched once more, swinging out to counter, but it only found its lightning sapped away. When the vibrational force struck its chest, it was as though its entire body had begun to quake. Lionel's pupils constricted, pulling back the vibrational energy quickly just before the demon burst into a rain of blood. But by that point, its internal organs had already been turned to mush. Its eyes glazed over and it collapsed to the ground slowly. Chapter 1590. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:57 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 1590. Change of tactics. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel exhaled a breath and stored the demon corpse away. By this point, he easily had a few hundred, and his point total only increased by leaps and bounds. In the Fiend class sector, a single lower class demon gave 100,000 demon points, middle class was upward of several million, and high class was in the tens of millions easily, with some of the stronger and rarer ones being upward of hundreds of millions. By this point, unless he found a rare and especially useful demon, Lionel mostly killed and stored middle and higher Fiend class demons. So, his point total increased by leaps and bounds. Although it was still marginal compared to his original point totals, he had still increased his total points by at least 20 or so %, a jump that was definitely noticeable. However, even after several days, Lionel still hadn't found an exchange point. He was beginning to wonder if he was searching incorrectly, if there was a trick he was aware of, or maybe, the worst-case scenario, there were no exchange points here at all. It was possible that the treasures of the Fiend class sector were valuable enough that one would have to exchange with the great families personally. That would make things much more difficult to handle. I think it's time to change approaches. I've already gathered more than enough demon corpses to bring out the full potential and then some of the individuals who will be the core members of my army. Although it would always be better to have more, I need to change gears now or else I might end up running out of time. If that happens, it'll be too late to regret. In that case, I should start targeting people instead of demons. If he was lacking in information, he would just have to find what he was lacking in, and the best bet were the geniuses here. The trouble was that Lionel had always taken a wide path around them all. In these last several days, he had run into more than just a few, but even if they saw his dome of fog, they wouldn't dare to casually enter it. And, even those bold enough to do so simply wouldn't be able to catch Lionel if he wanted to run. He detected them long before they detected him, and his escape abilities at this point were quite potent. Avoiding these geniuses and not getting involved with them just seemed like the best choice to make. These individuals here were decided to be strong enough to have a chance at clearing out 10% of the demons in this demon bubble. Such monsters weren't individuals that Lionel should dare to take casually. But it seemed that he would have to seek them out this time. Lionel's gaze narrowed. If he had to choose, he would choose the one of them he was already familiar with. Lionel closed his eyes. He unleashed the full strength of his starry spirit domain, which had only grown more powerful after the fusion with his Aurora Black Panda. But even before that, he hadn't unleashed its full strength. There was simply no need. It wasted too much stamina, and the range he had now was more than enough. However, now that he was actively looking for someone, Lionel didn't allow his fog domain to increase in size. There was no point, and it would only alert others. But his starry spirit domain increased explosively in size. 10 kilometers. 20 kilometers. 50 kilometers. 100 kilometers. 110 kilometers, there. Lionel's eyes snapped open, his starry spirit domain rubber banding back to its original size. He shot forward, his construct leaving streaks of dark gold in his wake. The Aurora Black Panda wasn't meant to have such speed, as it didn't have a speed branch. But after fusing with the starry-tailed fox, its speed was even faster than the Lionel's original starry-tailed fox lineage had been alone. It was agile and speedy, its 9 total eyes shining with a fierce light as it tore a path through the wind. With his Aurora Star Force, Lionel could even decrease his and the weight of the construct to virtually nothing, making his speed even faster. He was nothing more than a blur, crossing kilometers at a time in just a few seconds. With a flash, 4 of his palms slammed together, causing the vibrational force that had infused into his rotating lotuses to disperse to his back, spurring on his speed even faster. At the same time, the configuration of the lotuses began to shift and change, warping to a new maze of layered leaves that the spatial affinity youth from before would very quickly recognize. All this time, Lionel had shrunk his fog barrier to just the immediate few meter distance around him. But the instant he was within range of his target, it exploded forth once again, completely enveloping him. Huh! The young man was caught completely off guard. Seeing the familiar fog, his eyes widened. He subconsciously spread his internal sight outward, only to realize that it was just as useless as it had been before. He instantly changed tactics, spreading out his spatial force instead, his gaze turning serious. However, an instant later, his expression warped to an ugly sight to behold. Before, he had been able to circumvent Lionel's domain by using his spatial force as a sensory organ instead of his internal sight. But now, he found that even his spatial force was being interrupted. Could it be that he was correct all along? Was Lionel just feigning weakness? What the young man couldn't see was that the world around him was completely covered in floating lotuses. Every time he sent his force outward, it would immediately be swallowed up by these rotating lotuses and turn into an enigmatic force that seemed to push and pull on time itself. The lotuses had a similar but far more potent ability in comparison to Lionel's heavenly body realm comprehension, warping one's perception of time. However, Lionel had restrained the effect, not allowing the young man to sense it just yet. The young man unleashed a wave of spatial force, forming a concentrated barrier around himself as his foot began to pivot so that he could look for where his enemy might be coming from. Chapter 1591. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:57 and 5 seconds AM Chapter 1591, Monster. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. In that instant, a palm suddenly appeared above the young man's head, causing his expression to change. He could no longer use his spatial force in long range, but he had concentrated it to the point where even Lionel's lotuses took a long time to cut into it. As such, within a 5-meter radius of him, he could sense everything clearly. In addition, because of the special abilities of space, he could sense ripples of space up to 15 meters away. Whereas the sight range of internal sight ended abruptly, all space was connected to more space. Any changes to the mesh would inevitably have extended travel. However, while this was the case, the face of the young man was still ugly because he could feel his stamina being quickly drained as Lionel forced him to replenish his dome of spatial force again and again. The young man released a growl, his palm shooting up to meet Lionel's. A wild ripple of space and pure power met. Bang! Lionel's palm was forced back up, but the knees of the young man bent so fiercely that he almost fell to the ground. The latter grit his teeth hard. He flipped over 2 palms, a twin pair of silver sickles appearing in his hands for just a moment before he threw them out with all the strength he could muster. Before they even landed, he flipped his hands over one again, forming another pair, one of which he threw in the air above his head only to replace it with another flip of his palm. 5 silver sickles manifested in quick succession, one of which hovered high in the air and 2 of which were quickly spinning toward Lionel's chest. Lionel's gaze flashed. This was another issue with his lotus domain, it was useless against physical objects. That said, while these were physical objects, it was powered by something quite obvious. The twin giant lotuses surrounding Lionel Panda Construct spun, ripping the spatial force from the twin pair of sickles, stripping them of all their profundity before snatching them out of the air with 2 hands. At the same time, 2 of his arms wielded his spear, piercing straight for the young man's forehead. If such a blow landed, let alone being pierced through, the young man would find his head shattered into a rain of blood and gore. The young man crossed his arms about his chest, the 3rd sickle above his head swinging down as though it had a mind of its own, carrying with it a fierce momentum. The 3 sickles blocked with a single mind, their 3 blades intersecting. But even before they struck, the eyes of the young man widened. He suddenly couldn't sense his other 2 sickles anymore. What the hell happened? There was no way for him to see beyond this fog, and his internal sight was entirely useless. He felt as though he was trying to swim forward in a raging, relentless storm. Bang! Spear and sickles met, the resonating boom sending violent ripples of space in all directions. The eyes of the young man glowed with a cold light. These brats really thought that he was a pushover. After he had run away the first time, he realized that he had been overly cautious. That woman he had battled had been blown away too easily by his spatial barrier. And, as he meditated on the lotus that tricked him that day, he realized that it was just a clever trick to redirect his spatial force. While it was quite profound, it wasn't impossible to circumvent. If it wasn't for this fog barrier that messed with his senses, how could he be toyed with like this? He was a fiend-class genius. While he had no chance at the top prize, he had pride of his own. How could he lose to 2 who had just been promoted from the human class? Fury lit his gaze, a silvery light exploding forth from his eyes. With their blades connected like this, he knew exactly where Lionel was. He would make them pay for daring to underestimate him. The silvery light grew, becoming a vaporous sort of energy that almost looked like dancing solar flares. Die. Just as the young man spoke that word, his eyes widened. At that moment, a twin pair of sickles he couldn't have been more familiar with had come back toward him. They arched so beautifully in the air that, for a moment, he was mesmerized. Too few people knew that even in comparison to bowmanship, Lionel was on a completely different level when it came to using throwing weapons. As much control as he had over his bow, when the medium of the bow was removed and all that was left was the weapon and himself, he was a god. The young man simply couldn't react at all. The odd time force distorted his reality entirely, cutting through his spatial barrier as though it was never there at all. And maybe that was because to that pair of sickles, the spatial barrier hadn't been erected yet. The pair of sickles ripped into either side of the young man's collarbone, rotating through his lungs and out his shoulder blades. The young man coughed up a mouthful of blood, his control over his force waning as he shot backward. Bang! He collided with a tree just as the blades exited his shoulder blades, and just like that, his blades hooked into the tree's black bark, leaving him hanging as his blood slowly dripped down. The young man coughed and wheezed, his blood slowly leaking down from his body. However, his mind remained clear enough for a deep fear to shake his heart. Time Force. That was definitely Time Force. What kind of monster had he offended? The fog around the panda construct and the spatial affinity youth dispersed, revealing a looming 10-meter-tall form to the latter. Lionel sat with Aina in his arms, a light smile on his face. He seemed to be in a good mood, as though he hadn't just fought a vicious battle. Just one mistake back there and he could have very well been the one nailed to a tree. Luckily he had already analyzed this young man's ability previously, and the latter was very unlucky that Lionel's spatial affinity was quite good as well, allowing him to more easily restrain the youth, all while using less stamina to sustain his yin-yang domain. Just answer my questions honestly and they'll have no reason to kill you. Chapter 1592. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:59 and 37 seconds AM. Chapter 1592. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1592. Effort. The young man grit his teeth, but now that he was pinned down and Lionel's lotuses were spinning around him, there was little he could do. The trees of the demon world were far too sturdy and his weapons were far too elite to be so easily dealt with. Now that he was pinned up like this, there was simply nothing he could do but be obedient. First question, why are you alone? This wasn't what was at the forefront of Lionel's mind, but he wanted to soften this young man up a bit and also get a baseline for him. With the young man in his dream world, every single detail of his being was imprinted into Lionel's mind. If he wanted to lie after Lionel had grasped a feeling for when he was telling the truth, it would be almost impossible. The young man looked toward Lionel with disdain. He realized that Lionel must have thought that teaming up happened here just like everywhere else. This is the fiend class sector, not some kiddie pool, the young man replied with a sneer. Lionel sighed and shook his head. Bang! A palm of the panda construct slammed into the tree, shocking the young man and causing it to sway about wildly. The young man grit his teeth, the pain of his body swaying on blades more than just a few words could describe. Unfortunately, he had the sturdy body and bones of a sixth-dimensional existence, and he could only experience his body being slowly cut into with every sway. I need answers, not cheeky replies. Get to the point and stick to it. While you're at it, put away that condescending look and smirk. In case you didn't notice, your life and death is in my hands. The young man's jaw steeled. If looks could kill, maybe a laser would have already pierced right through Lionel's forehead already. But he remained unmoved, his gaze growing frighteningly cold as an aura of majesty exuded from him. There are no groupings in the fiend class sector, the young man spoke through gritted teeth, the demon world bubble is too large. It's easier to split up, and that's part of the challenge anyway. Lionel's eyes narrowed. Easier to split up. Too large? This made sense, this place was indeed far too large. Since this is a real world, how exactly do you plan on counting the 10% mark? Were all of these demons already tagged? The young man's brows furrowed. This Lionel Olidarch really didn't understand a single thing at all, did he? But this made sense, the young man had never even heard of an Olidarch family, so it had to be a small place that gained some good luck and produced a genius like this. Maybe he could take advantage of this? 10%? What do you mean? Lionel shook his head. Bang! Another palm slammed into the tree. This one was even harder than the last, causing the young man to seesaw on the two sickles as though he was trying to cut himself into 3 pieces. He roared out in pain, his body trembling. But while Lionel had made a move to stop the sway before, he allowed the swaying to naturally end this time. Don't waste my time, Lionel said coldly. Now, I'll ask you again, how exactly do you plan on counting the 10% mark? Lionel could already see the markers for recognition in the young man's eyes the moment he mentioned 10%, but now he was pretending like he didn't know? It was a stupid lie, but it was also a good one for Lionel to call him out on. The earlier he caught the young man in a lie and the earlier he made him realize that he couldn't be lied to, the less likely he would be to lie in the future. If Lionel's question continuously became more complex, even with his abilities, if the young man became smart and started to tell half-truths, it would become difficult to differentiate them. With things being like this, it would be less likely to be a problem. Like this, Lionel began to squeeze out all the information he needed. 10 minutes later, he nodded and turned to leave, leaving the young man pinned to the tree. As far as Lionel was concerned, he could figure out a way down himself. Things are more complicated than I thought, but also simpler depending on how you look at things. Things worked a lot differently in the Fiend class sector, and it turned out that he and Aina were left in the dark all the while. However, it was a good thing that they had been, because without their current strength, knowing would have been absolutely useless. The reason Lionel hadn't found an exchange all this time was because in this sector, even earning a chance to exchange required a hard battle. He had to find certain demons with gems hidden within their bodies. These gems could be shattered for a direct teleportation into a new space where he could then exchange for what he needed. The value of the gem and the quality of store you were teleported to was dependent, unsurprisingly, on the strength of the demon. If Lionel wanted a path to the highest echelon exchange there was, he either needed to defeat 1 Tier 9 higher Fiend class demon with a gem, 10 Tier 9 middle Fiend class demons with a gem, or 100 Tier 9 lower Fiend class demons with a gem. With the latter two options, the gems would have to be combined into one using a special method which would still require higher Fiend class demon blood, in other words, battle and more battling. Without the strength to defeat a higher Fiend class demon, you could forget about getting a chance to enter the best exchanges. This rule was likely put in place for the likes of Lionel, who gathered so many points in the human class sector and hoped to use them here. In the past, this would have been a huge hurdle to jump for Lionel. But now, it would just require a bit more effort. Before, he had just been looking for demons compatible with himself, Aina and his friends. But now that he knew he had to look for gems, his entire outlook shifted. Chapter 1593. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:59 and 37 seconds AM. Chapter 1593. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1593. The best trap. Lionel began to quickly make good on what he had missed out on. The gems were most likely to be found in demons with spatial affinities. This made them very difficult to catch and lock down, and since they were quite rare, just finding them was a great hassle. Lionel had no reason to hunt down such demons previously because he didn't know anyone with such a higher spatial affinity that would also be in need of such demon carcasses aside from maybe that genius of Earth, Careless. He had been potentially thinking of nailing down some with spatial affinities later on if he had the time remaining, but it hadn't been an absolute top priority until this moment. Now, he would go all out against them. As for their escaping abilities, he wasn't worried. Lionel began to quickly cut down one after another, quickly racking them up. Defeating a Tier 9 higher Fiend class demon was simply impossible, a Tier 9 middle Fiend class one was still too difficult. However, 100 Tier 9 lower Fiend class demons was something that he could just barely handle. The first 2 or 3 were actually exceptionally difficult. At Tier 9, the gap was so large that even Lionel had trouble making it up. He had to use a series of tricks and ambushes to get his way. However, as he grew accustomed to the kind of spatial affinities these demons had, he began to see patterns, and it made deploying his lotus domains even faster. As Lionel added more and more spatial forces to his repertoire of lotuses, it became easier to dissect and calculate new lotus formations for spatial forces that he didn't recognize. At the same time, he became even more adept at using the time forces that they generated on the other end. There came a point where Lionel grew confident that so long as his enemy used spatial forces, he could one-shot them. Of course, the caveat was that they had to use force at a level at this lotus domains could counter. Unfortunately, for now, the control higher Fiend class demons had over their forces, especially at the highest tiers, already crossed into realms where it was near impossible for Lionel to wrest control in. However, Lionel had no intention of targeting such demons. He would find exactly what he needed here. Lionel's illusory spear cut out once again, splitting the head of a black-horned demon in two. It had been 3 days since he tortured the young man, or rather Fallon of the defensive ward pavilion, and he finally claimed his last gem. Lionel now had exactly what he needed save for one item, the blood of a higher fiend-class spatial affinity demon. The good news was that this one didn't need to be tier 9, it could be any tier. So Lionel was hoping to find one that was either tier 1 or tier 2 to handle. He felt that he was beginning to run out of time as the competition on the leaderboards had only become fiercer. The secret of the gems wasn't the only thing Lionel had learned about in these 3 days. According to his new understanding, the top prize of this sector wasn't based on the 10% rule. Rather, it was a bit special. According to Fallon, one first had to enter the top 10 in points. Once 10 trillion points had been accumulated across all participants, the top 10 would be locked in and the final phase would begin. Within this final phase, every one of the top 10 would be granted a chase. This chance would be used to teleport them to a new region where a final demon would be waiting. This would trigger a one-on-one battle where the first of the 10 to win would be granted victory. Then, once this battle was concluded, one could then use the exchange method to teleport to the highest level exchange and claim your top prize. Due to these rules, most with a chance had likely already killed a tier 9 higher fiend class demon to claim the gem they needed and would be immediately ready to do teleport should they be the first to claim victory. However, that also left a slight problem for Lionel to face as well. Most had ignored his existence earlier because they all rightfully assumed that he had come from the human class sector. As such, they assumed that he would fall quickly from the top 10 spot he had claimed, and this much had been true at the beginning. Lionel quickly fell and was about to fall out of the top 10 entirely when his points suddenly began to jump upward. From falling out of the top 10, he began to maintain his ranking. Although he didn't move up, his descent downward started to slow enough that those on the fringe began to panic and look for him. The ranking wasn't necessarily entirely about strength. There were many near the bottom that would have a great chance at winning the one-on-one battle first. Take Lionel, for example. A huge reason for his killing speed was his internal sight and dream world, and his ability to quickly locate perfect targets for himself. Not everyone had such an ability. In the minds of many on the fringes, hovering between 15th and 11th place, they had already realized that their only chance at claiming a top 10 spot was to take Lionel down. At the same time, those hovering around Lionel's rank knew what those below were thinking. As such, many of them wanted to deal with Lionel themselves as a strictly defensive tactic. Like this, every individual from 15th to 7th place had their antennas up in search of Lionel, tracking a moving dome of fog and attempting to corner him inch by inch. Unfortunately, Lionel's escape abilities were too great and he often found them long before they even spotted him. Lionel's luck, though, was bound to run out. Some understood that it was best to work smarter, not harder. Rank 13, Thela Urizana, Endless Twilight Pavilion. Thela had realized something very interesting. While noting the point jumps in Lionel's score, she realized that he was suddenly entirely focused on killing lower fiend class demons. Realizing this, she made a guess at to Lionel's goal and realized that once he hit 100, he would be looking out for a higher fiend class spatial affinity demon that would be easy to deal with. She knew just how rare such creatures were and she happened to have the perfect ability to lie in wait. This wasn't a camouflage ability, but rather a cloning ability. With time running out, she was confident that Lionel would come even if he knew it was a trap. She was very clever. Just by observing Lionel's point total, she was able to tell that Lionel had no intention of joining the final battle. It wasn't that he didn't want to, but rather that he didn't even have the strength to. And she was very much correct. Lionel had no intention of chasing after the top prize in this sector, he simply wasn't strong enough. He couldn't even defeat a tier 4 higher fiend class demon, but this final demon was most definitely not just tier 9, but a tier 9 higher fiend class demon that was an elite amongst them all. In fact, there was even a small chance that it might be a chaos demon. This was why Lionel was in such a rush. There was no way he could allow himself to be teleported to the final battle, but he also couldn't give up his points because he needed them to trade for the final item that would get them home. This left him with only one choice. He had to leave the demon world, and there was only one path to doing so that solved everything, and that path needed a higher fiend-class demon's blood. Thela didn't have to try very hard. While Lionel had been fighting these last 3 days, she had found and marked several such demons, leaving 8 clones hidden nearby their locations. When she spotted Lionel's fog domain quickly approaching one of them, her lips spread in a beautiful smile and all of her clones suddenly vanished in an instant, fusing into her main body. Her prey was here. Within the fog domain, Lionel's eyes were narrowed and his jaw was clamped shut. The best trap was one an enemy knew was there and still had to run into. He was very used to using his intelligence against others, but it seemed it was his turn to take a taste of his own medicine. Chapter 1594. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:59 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 1594. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1594. Amusing. Lionel's frown settled down, his features smoothing out and his countenance becoming frighteningly cold. He didn't know who this woman was, but he was absolutely certain that she was extraordinarily powerful. In addition, he could deduce exactly why she was waiting here, so she was also very much confident in the gap between their strength. With just a single glance, Lionel could tell that this young woman was in Tier 9 of the 6th dimension. Not only that, but she was also comparable to a high fiend-class demon, or else she wouldn't even dare to come here to fight Lionel for a chance to fight an elite demon to begin with. In all likelihood, then, this young woman was not only comparable to a high fiend-class demon, but she also should be comparable to an elite one even among them. Lionel immediately noticed her fusing back with her clones. Her doing such a thing, especially so prematurely, seemed to open up a gap for Lionel to escape. After all, now that her clones had vanished from the sides of the other demons, so long as Lionel ran, he should be able to escape her. The main issue with that, though, was that Lionel didn't believe that someone intelligent enough to force him of all people to walk into such a trap could possibly make such a rookie mistake. In fact, he calculated that there was a better than 80% probability that should he try to run now, he would end up in an even worse situation. Although he couldn't be certain, this young woman likely had other contingency plans ready to deal with him, and it made him feel somewhat wary that he couldn't immediately sense. In that case, there was only one option to take: do the very thing she least expected him to do. Bang! The ground beneath Lionel's panda construct shattered and he rippled through space like a beam of light. In a mere instant he appeared at the edge of his fog domain, and then everything shifted and changed. Lionel went from being the center of his fog domain, to being at the edge, and then instantly becoming the center once more. Just like that, the barrier which had been a distance away from Thela appeared right at the edge of his nose, causing her brows to shoot up. The sudden change was so fast and quick that her heart couldn't help but skip a beat, only to quickly calm a moment later. She hadn't expected Lionel's fog domain to move so suddenly and quickly. It was hard to fathom. Domains like this one should take time to shift, and they definitely shouldn't just flash forward by 10 kilometers in the blink of an eye. But what Thela didn't know was that this wasn't the work of just one domain, but 2 of them. And, what she also didn't know is that while her heart relaxed just the smallest bit when she realized the domain had stopped right in front of her, a bow had already appeared in the hands of Lionel's panda construct, and in less than half a breath, it had already formed an arrow, and said formed arrow had been released. It shot through Lionel's domain with an impossibly great speed. At such a level, it should have made a whistling noise in the air or released cacophonic booms of shattering sound barriers, and yet it was deathly silent, too silent. Lionel's starry light domain had formed a tunnel of light for it to shuttle through, following its arc with absolute perfection, as though Lionel had already predicted the exact trajectory of the arrow, because that was precisely what he had done. Danger. The brows of Thela shot up. It wasn't an especially strong scent of danger, but something told her that she might fall into an ever-growing precarious state if she took one wrong step. The higher one's dimension, the more in tune with this instinctive feeling one became, and this was especially true for those that had formed star runes and god runes. Intuition was something even the primitive man of Lionel's spear domain heirloom had been able to grasp and pass along to Lionel. But this was an especially special case, and just went to show how amazing the spear masters of the ring were even at the lowest levels. But at these tiers and realms, intuition became an instinctual part of everyone's fighting style, and it would often dictate exactly how they planned to react. Feeling such a thing, Thela immediately reacted, her palms flaring outward and ripples of space flowing like a current around her. Bang! At that exact moment, Leonel's fog domain flashed forward once more, suddenly cutting off Thela's vision the instant she was feeling comfortable once again. Although Thela thought that this might happen, the timing was an issue. The instant Leonel's arrow was about to peek outside of the fog domain that was barely a centimeter from Thela's nose, her vision and internal sight vanished. Bang! 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 Thela immediately chose to retreat, but Leonel's arrow slaughtered the layers of her spatial force, rushing for her nose. The feeling of danger became absolutely overwhelming, and yet it was precisely at that moment that Leonel flashed once more, appearing to Thela's back with a piercing spear. An arrow from the front and a spear from the back. Thela was completely pincered and had nowhere to go. However, it was precisely at that moment that her serious expression became a cold smile. A mere tier 1 6-star wanted to fight her? How amusing. Her hands shifted through the air and several new runes formed. In an instant, the situation changed. Leonel's arrow, which had been coming toward her skull, multiplied into 3 and suddenly vanished, appearing to her back and intercepting the tip of Leonel's spear. Leonel's attack met Leonel's attack, the sudden stunning reality forcing him to take a single strong step back. The ripples of space around Thela became 10 times stronger than they were previously, to the point where she levitated into the air, gracefully dancing out of the way of the reverberating impact of Leonel's collision as a bottom of red liquid manifested in her palm. Chapter 1595. Published at 30th of January 2023 9:59 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 1595. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1595. Obliged. Thela smiled a sweet smile as silence fell over the area, playing with the bottle in her hand. This is the blood you wanted, right? No need to answer, I already know that that's the case. But if you think this pitiful amount of strength is going to be enough, I would suggest that you obediently hand over your head to me. If you do so, I can take care of your oligarch family while you're gone. If not, and you force me to fight this battle to the end and waste my time, then not only will I not lift a finger to help your oligarch family, I'll also kill them to the last man, woman and child. Make your choice quickly, my time is limited. Thela obviously didn't want to fight this battle. If she could voluntarily get Leonel to give up his life, that was for the best. Unfortunately, there was no simple way to exchange points in the Fiend class sector. Due to the top 10 rules, and in order to mitigate the use of teamwork, an exchange of points wasn't possible. That was why, although there were 2 members of the Endless Twilight Pavilion in the top 10, Thela still had to fight for her spot on her own instead of borrowing from 2 who should have been her teammates. Due to this, the only way to take points from someone else was to kill them. This was also why Leonel hadn't gained Fallon's demon points either. If Thela wanted Leonel's points, the only method was to kill him. But this fog domain and Leonel's abilities were far too troublesome, and if there was no chance at all, Leonel could very well just run away despite the contingency plans she had made. As such, she chose to immediately set down her requirements. If she threatened Leonel later, when she had less control over the situation, she would come off as the weaker party. If she did so immediately, though, especially after so easily dealing with his attack, even if he didn't immediately accept, a shadow would be cast over his heart and he would definitely hesitate. What Thela didn't know, though, was that the moment Leonel heard these words, the frostiness of his gaze went from purely due to him focusing on calculation, to him being infuriated. What a vile woman. Leonel didn't care about the oligarch family or if they were wiped out. In fact, he assumed that once he vanished from thin air, they would suffer such a fate just for being associated with him. However, it was the principle of the matter that left him enraged. The only reason Leonel didn't care about the fate of the oligarch family was because they had harmed a great deal of individuals. In fact, if he was correct, that restaurant he had worked in when he first reached their city had likely been wiped out to the final person. However, these weren't matters that Thela was aware of. Leonel could tell by the look in her eyes and the curl of her lips that she wasn't bluffing in the slightest. She had every intention of doing what she said, and for what, exactly? Resources? Treasures? Glory? If she knew who his true family was, wouldn't she target them? If she could find where his mother was, where his brothers and cousin were, where the people he cared about were hidden, would she even hesitate? Lionel's gaze sparkled with a crimson light, dense golden runes dancing within his irises. He had already figured out what force she was using, but it wasn't an easy one to handle at all despite the fact he had become very used to making spatial forces his own. In fact, from what Lionel could see, her cloning abilities and spatial affinity were actually linked as one, likely to form an odd ability index or lineage factor. The force it was based on was called emulation spatial force. It was an exceptionally rare spatial force ranked in the top 5 of spatial forces, and it was an even rarer fusion of dream force and spatial force. Among dream forces, it was actually quite weak, but among spatial forces, it had the greatest dexterity, flexibility, and manipulability. Essentially, using a combination of spatial force and dream force, Thela was able to recreate all sorts of illusions that could interact with the world. The spatial force aspect applied real, tangible changes to the world, while the dream force aspect formed illusions that hid the involvement of spatial force. This only confirmed Lionel's speculations. Thela didn't need to fuse with her clones, they weren't technically real clones to begin with. But because they could move through space, she could put down a clone an impossibly far distance away because even in comparison to light, spatial force moved faster. It was no wonder that Thela was intelligent enough to force even Lionel into a trap. Those with dream force affinity all tended to be extremely intelligent in comparison to their peers. And, due to the fact Thela wasn't layering dream force atop of spatial force, and her emulation spatial force was a perfect fusion of the two, despite Lionel's exceptionally high dream force affinity, he couldn't instantly form a counter to it. In addition, since Thela's illusions were actually real and capable of interacting with the world, being able to see through them was useless. After all, they weren't fake, they could truly hurt him. The most fearsome part of this emulation spatial force was the last ability Thela had displayed just now. In a mere instant, she had gone from damsel to copying his arrow with her emulation spatial force and pasting it twice more, forcing Lionel to face not just one of his own attacks, but 3 of them. Despite having come to understand this, Lionel's expression only became colder and colder. He didn't care how powerful Thela was. It was fine that she had been clever enough to get him here. This was a competition after all, he couldn't be mad that she was trying her best for herself. But now, she had taken it a step too far. 2 of Lionel's arms held up a bow, and of the remaining 4, 2 held his spear and the other 2 hovered in the air, palms open, as though waiting for something to land in them. At the same time, a large twin pair of lotuses appeared hovering to his back, tilting forward from its base and forming an enormous disk behind Lionel. And then, 3 vibrant blue stars appeared, pulsing with a blinding light. He didn't want to do this because it was too dangerous. But this caution was unwarranted. He was a man with 2 destruction rune-laden innate nodes in his body. A man who had spent years suppressing anarchic force within his body. If there was anyone who could control the opposite of vital star force, it was him. Since Thela liked to play with life and death so much, he would oblige. The vibrant blue energy began to crawl forward, entering the rotating formation of lotuses and beginning to seep into the ground with a deathly dark blue aura. Chapter 1596. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 1596. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1596. Silver waves. The 2 remaining free hands of Lionel's panda clapped together, releasing a sonic boom as fearsome as a clap of thunder. The rushing black fog gathered together as Lionel's bowstring was drawn back. The signal of danger roared in Thela's mind, several times more powerful than it had been before. It was so violent that her brows shot up, her eyes widened and goosebumps racing across her skin. Thela didn't hesitate, releasing a roar that manifested a star to her back. It sparkled with silvery lights and just the faintest hint of blue. It would only take a single glance for others to see that this was a manifestation of her emulation spatial force. The space around her rippled so violently that it formed visible waves of silver and black in the air. In one moment, she had gone from a sneering mastermind to what looked like a goddess standing amidst tall silver waves. Her star shimmered behind her like a radiant moon. Her hands pressed together, a strong fighting intent blazing from her. The moment Lionel released his arrow, she sensed it. But what shook her heart was that the ripples in space were less ripples, and more a violent destruction of the integrity of space itself. Thila's mind spun at incredible speeds, quickly forcing her shock down. Logically, the only existences capable of destroying space like this were the monsters of at least the 7th star. They could forcefully impose their will on the world, even increasing their speed by bending the laws of physics to their wills. At the 8th star level, such an existence would be able to cause true destruction, their strength reaching beyond the bounds of reason. Once this realm was touched upon in earnest, rules like the impossibility of destroying energy were thrown out of the window. However, there were methods of accomplishing this long before reaching these levels if certain parameters were met or if certain forces were under your control. As someone adept at illusions, there was hardly a single force that Thila didn't at least have some familiarity with. So, the moment she sensed such destruction, she thought of 3 forces immediately. Scarlet Star Force, Death Force and Fallen Star Force. Of these 3, there wasn't a single one that she hoped to run into. They were all incredibly fearsome and every single one of them had the strength to pose a real risk to her. By the time Thila finished these thoughts, the air had already entered her rippling waves. The closer it got, the more she was certain. This was most definitely Fallen Star Force. Thila's expression became more dignified. While all 3 would be able to threaten her, Fallen Star Force was especially heavy. It was like an anchor sinking into darkness that wanted to take everything with it. While Scarlet Star Force crumbled something from the inside out, Fallen Star Force seemed to use a violent gravitational energy to shred everything in its path to pieces. Both were lethal for different reasons, but if there was one that was especially dangerous when formed into a speeding arrow like this one, it was without a doubt this dense black force hiding within a silvery light. All of Thila's spatial force bent around the path of the arrow, weighing it down and shredding it into piece, appearing before her in a flash. Thila's expression was ice-cold by this point. Her spatial barrier might have been ripped apart, but it had bought her enough time to think and calmly analyze the situation. It was obvious that she wouldn't be able to get Lionel to simply hand over his head. In that case, she would need to take it herself. One of her hands formed several changing seals and her other hand flipped over to reveal a translucent whip that looked like it was carved of glass, and yet it seemed to have even more flexibility than a normal whip. Her whip-wielding hand flexed, her wrist forming a spiral pattern. At the same time, within her body, her nodes and nodal pathways shifted. Her whip shot forward, forming a tornado around the incoming arrow, and a rush of powerful water force followed suit. So she has that ability? Lionel had seen this ability index once before from an envoy of the Void Senate. With those hand seals, she was able to instantly shift the position of her nodes and just as instantly cast a technique without circulating her force. This means that her emulation spatial force is more likely to be related to a lineage factor. In that case, I have to be more careful because a lineage factor is rarely just an affinity and an affinity alone, there are other factors attached to it. Thila used the easiest tactic, overwhelming the Fallen Star Force until it had run out of energy. She refused to fight it head-on and she also refused to allow Lionel to just sit back and shoot arrows toward her freely. Her spatial ripples reformed and became even more powerful as a second star appeared to her back. If before she could cover 10 or so meters within Lionel's starry star domain, it had now ballooned to 30 meters. She enveloped Lionel's construct in those ripples and her pupils constricted when she saw the presence of 3 stars. A Tier 1 could already manifest 3 stars. Thila's expression only became colder. The longer she allowed this fight to drag out, the more variables would appear. She was already running out of time, this was simply unacceptable. Her whip shot forward like a venomous viper. At that moment, it became difficult to differentiate its strikes and her emulation spatial force. The translucent properties of the whip fused into the silvery waves as though it was right at home. Bang! 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 Lionel took several heavy steps backward as his bow was drawn once more. The whistle of an arrow caused Thila's ears to twitch. Chapter 1597. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 1597. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1597. Shattered. Thila split into 6 clones, her body shifting and avoiding the arrow. Bang! 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 Lionel's spear shot forward again and again, each attached with a word or phrase. His mind quickly analyzed the strikes of Thila, saw through the smallest of flaws, and used his comprehension to choose the best combination to deflect it away. But the strength gap was far too great, especially now that he was facing 6 clones all at once. Thila seemed to want to end this all as quickly as possible. Lionel released another arrow, but his pupils constricted when Thila's real body instantly shifted with one of her clones, avoiding his attack and only suffering the blow with a fake. The combination of illusion and space was too useful. When their battle first began, Thila had called over her other clones from dozens of kilometers away and they instantly returned to her. Now, she was using this same ability as an evasion technique. Lionel had simply never seen such high-level applications of force. At the same time as Lionel was in awe, Thila was steeped in derision and disdain. To have such a powerful force and only be capable of using it to attack, he really does come from a backwater family I've never heard of. Such a high-level force and he doesn't even know how to use it properly. Pathetic. Thila's whip became faster as a 4th star manifested to her back. She pressed harder and harder, feeling that time was running out. At first, she wanted to be more cautious, and she still was, but she also knew that there was a point where the effort wasn't worth the return. If it wasn't for these weird domains Lionel kept pulling out, she would have defeated him in a few exchanges. He was unable to threaten her, so she would press harder. Bang! 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 3 of Thila's stars were of emulation spatial force, but the 4th was also silver one. The moment these appeared, her water force changed, losing its delicate blue color and becoming almost like streams of mercury. The streams of liquid metal fused into Thila's rippling spatial waves, making them heavier and denser. At the same time, her whip became even more difficult to strike and its attacks became more and more lethal. Thila's clones all unfurled a hand, twisting their wrists about. At that instant, the whips they wielded that were only formed of emulation spatial force fused with this mercury-like water force, making their attacks also several times more forceful. Lionel's expression flickered, but the moment he suffered the first attack, his spear construct cracked. He was immediately forced to repair it, but the second attack also forced it to crack. His panda construct shuddered, his steps backward becoming more frequent and harder to stop. His stamina drained faster and faster. With every attempt to maintain his construct, the amount of force within him was being taken away at a quicker rate. Lionel's cold gaze was frightening, but it couldn't change anything. If he was fighting with his real body, he would have already been beaten into a half-dead state. He knew that he couldn't allow his construct to collapse. Without it, setting aside himself, it would put Aina in a direct line of fire. And knowing the kind of venom that was within Thila's heart, he couldn't even hope that she would be spared. If it wasn't for the fact his construct enveloped himself and Aina, making it impossible for Thila to tell that there was someone with him, he was certain that she would try to take advantage. No matter how infuriated Lionel was by this disciple of the endless Twilight Pavilion, there was little he could do about the power she wielded. She was stronger, faster and more adept in practically all facets in comparison to him. On top of that, her abilities perfectly fused into one, and while her thinking speed and intelligence wasn't quite on Lionel's level, it wasn't far enough away that he could toy with her like he usually did against those with far higher stats than himself. Bang! 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 One of the arms of Lionel's panda construct shattered into a rain of Aurora star force. It tried to quickly reform under his control, but the gap was taken advantage of by Thila. She was attacking from 6 different directions at once, how could she not? Lionel immediately pierced out his spear with his real body. If the whip continued like this, it would most definitely shatter the chest of his panda construct and run right through his body. But, first, it would pierce through Aina who sat on his lap. Lionel's eyes were practically entirely crimson by this point, but it didn't change his base strength. His panda construct's chest shattered just as he expected. He couldn't even use his starry light domain because Thila's dense water force and spatial force had completely surrounded him, and his starry star domain spatial affinities were trash in comparison to Thila's spatial affinity. His spear could only meet her whip directly, his bronze runes lighting up to their maximum potential. And yet, his arm shattered. This seemed like an odd thing to say about a human's arm and not a construct, but that was just the best way to describe it. Lionel's arm's surface cracked like glass, his entire arm erupting in a shower of blood. It was impossible to even tell what kind of mangled state it was in beneath the rain of crimson. Lionel coughed up a mouthful of blood, taking Aina in an arm as both he and his construct were sent flying. He sent out another arrow just to buy himself some time, but Thila completely ignored it, shifting with one of her clones once again and directly sacrificing it as she unleashed a barrage directly upon Lionel. Lionel roared, using instant recovery, immediately and piercing forward with all his might. 5 whips collided with him at once. If before his arm shattered, it immediately became a bloody mist this time, the haziness and fog of crimson that hung in the air obstructing even Lionel's vision. Thila brandished her whips once again, a tide of spatial force and dense water force rushing forward with an endless momentum. Chapter 1598. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 1598. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1598. Helpless in the blink of an eye, a complex force art in the form of a shield appeared before Lionel. His force surged and it just as quickly took form. To his back, 2 dark blue stars appeared, their presence causing the space in the surroundings to tremble. The force of these void star force stars fueled the force art Lionel had manifested from within his dream world, giving it a strength that was several tens of times more powerful than if he used a normal water force. Boom! The shockwave sent Lionel flying back even faster than he had originally, but his eyes burned like 2 bright lights. The moment his void star force stars had appeared, the heaviness of Thila's mercury-like water force didn't seem so heavy anymore, and even the spatial force spread out into the surroundings began to twist and deform out of her control. Lionel didn't know much about void star force at all. He only knew that it represented the pinnacle of water force just like scarlet star force represented the pinnacle of fire force. However, the moment it appeared, he felt more in tune with it now than he ever had before. Lionel wasn't sure why this was, but if he had to guess, it was likely because of this new feeling his unearthed dark force affinity was giving him. Void star force was considered to be top 3 in dark forces, so there was potential there for this to be of help to Lionel. Lionel's position quickly shifted in the air. His right arm was gone and his inner organs were very much injured. He had been forced to use his instant recovery, already just so that he could have enough strength to block, and he wouldn't have another such opportunity anytime soon. However, Lionel threw out a demon corpse and a palm of his panda construct shattered it apart. A raging blood and fuel flew toward him and into his body, gaining 2 paths to choose from. Lionel, without hesitation, chose one and swallowed it whole. Instant recovery. Lionel's body flashed and his arm grew back out. All of this happened in an instant, even as his body was still flying backward. In fact, even his spear, which had been thrust back with him, was still there for him to snatch out and grab. Lionel's bronze runes erupted to life once again as a large number of illusory force arts formed in the skies. Biding his time wasn't working, plotting and scheming wasn't working, he couldn't even find a single opening. Aina was right, about his approach in battle, that is. He only incrementally showed his strength in battle because it was of benefit to him. Catching enemies off guard and slaughtering them before they could display their full strength had been the method to his victories for a very long time now. But this Thila. No, it felt like this entire zone in specific made this incredibly difficult. These geniuses were on an entirely different level and the methods with which they used their force was so multivariable and multi-layered that for Lionel, who didn't have nearly the same amount of flexibility, it was impossible to use his normal methods. The only way he would have the slightest inkling of a chase was to put everything on the table and use his abilities as freely as he could. Only that way might he stand a small chance. To Lionel's back, 7 stars erupted with life. 3 were a radiant sky blue, 2 were a murky dark blue, and the final 2 were a shining beacon of crimson gold light. Among them, the 2 red gold ones stood out the most, the presence of their star runes alone applying even more pressure on Thila's rippling silver waves. From being able to control a 100-meter radius with ease after her 3rd emulation spatial force star's appearance, it was forced back down to 10 meters in the blink of an eye. Lionel immediately gained some room to breathe, but he didn't relax for long. 3 arrows of red gold formed on his bow at once, shooting like streaking meteors toward Thila. Thila's eyes widened to the point it seemed like they would pop out of their sockets. She was absolutely certain, she couldn't have been more certain. Just then, in the final moment before her silver waves were forcefully restricted, she had definitely seen it. 7 stars? A 6-star expert should only have 6 at most. How did Lionel have 7? It didn't make any sense. When Thila sensed the coming arrows, her expression only became more unsightly. First Fallen Star Force and now Scarlet Star Force? Not only that, but Scarlet Star Force that was clearly powered by star runes? Her defenses couldn't deal with this, it was foolish to even try to defend. Thila swapped with another one of her clones, not understanding what was happening. How could one person control so many powerful forces? She had never even met someone with Scarlet Star Force stars before, such a thing was practically legend. The human race couldn't possibly form them, only the spirituals might have 1 or 2 appear in a generation, and very rarely, there might be a demon. But such a demon would most definitely be a chaos demon and wouldn't appear here. For Lionel to both have such stars and even have formed their star runes, especially the latter point. There was only one explanation, he had an innate node. Thila's expression danced between coldness and greed. She knew exactly how powerful innate nodes were, intimately. But such an innate node was not like others. Damn it, Thila found an entire sky of flood dragons rushing toward her, each fueled by Scarlet Star Force. She was absolutely infuriated. This idiot had no idea how to properly apply his force and all he knew how to do was ram it ahead into bigger, stronger attacks. Idiot. 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 Thila wasn't mad that Lionel wasn't strong enough, she was enraged that he was just strong enough to delay her. A fool like this couldn't possibly defeat her, the gap between them was too large. But when this talent was combined with the annoyance of this fog domain and the fact that Lionel could move about more freely with his starry light domain now that the effectiveness of her own stars had been limited, what was supposed to be a quick battle became long and protracted. Thila didn't even suffer a single injury, resolving every one of Lionel's attacks and evading the ones that she could not. She was too smart, too well-versed in battle, and her library of techniques and methods of applying force were far too vast. She could use just a single force like Emulation Star Force to evade, to defend, and to attack. And not only that, but she could do so in a myriad of different ways. She could evade by swapping with her clone or folding space. She could defend with those silvery waves or forming meat shields out of her clones and even had a special domain capable of mitigating force. As for her methods of attack, they were too numerous to even name. However, in the face of her skill, Lionel just threw an avalanche of everything he had. Magic spells covered the skies, he wielded 2 bows in 4 hands, shooting as fast as he could, and his spear became nothing more than a defensive tool. He was pressing just as hard as Thila. He couldn't afford to lose here, and he definitely couldn't go to fight that demon. He wouldn't be able to leave that one-on-one hell until the demon was killed, but at least here, there was still a small chance that he could escape. But the harder he pressed, the more strength Thila seemed to show and his force only seemed to dwindle faster. A helpless flicker of light appeared within Lionel's eyes. He looked down at Aina who was in deep meditation and realized that he couldn't just leave her here like this. He turned and began to run. Thila gritted her teeth. Don't think you can run from me. In a single blink, Lionel made it to the edge of his light domain and he used his earth force to bury her underground. Then, in another blink, he appeared before Thila once again sent out another powerful strike. Boom! The two separated, 4 of Lionel's panda construct's arms shattering to pieces once again. Thela released an infuriated screech, feeling that things were slipping out of her hands. Unfortunately, it was already too late. The 100 trillion demon point mark clicked into place and an energy that Lionel couldn't resist enveloped him. Thela could only watch as Lionel vanished, her glare absolutely murderous. The fog domain around her finally vanished and she began looking around with veins popping in her eyes. Even if Lionel died, she wouldn't let his soul rest in peace. Where did he hide that little bitch? She ground her teeth. She had already calculated that Lionel's flash teleportation range was only 10 kilometers, so there was a radius around here where Aina was. After she shattered Lionel's panda construct, her spatial force had caught on to the fact that there was a second person, but she seemed to be in a deep state of meditation that was difficult to come out of. Since she couldn't kill Lionel, she would go after his little lover. Fury rushed through her veins. She had actually failed to kill a Tier 1 instantly. She was absolutely livid and needed something to vent her answer on. Not only would she kill his little lover, but she would make sure it was a terrible death. A 10-kilometer radius? That was nothing. Lionel appeared in a world of darkness, his face pale and his breathing haggard. He clutched his spear in his hand, looking ahead in absolute silence. A heavy weight surrounded his body, threatening to force him to his knees. Chapter 1599. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 1599. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1599. Caged Lionel breathed heavily, his body feeling quite dry and his head threatening to burst. He wasn't very worried about Aina. He had only used his starry light domain in a 10 kilometers range in order to set up a trap for Thela, but he didn't get an opportunity to use it. Much like he could extend his starry spirit domain beyond 10 kilometers when he had been searching for the young man he interrogated, he could do the same with his starry light domain. Thela would likely think that Aina was buried somewhere in a 10-kilometer range, when in reality, she was over 50 kilometers away. In addition, he had left their collection of demons with her, so if it came to it, she would have more than enough blood force at her fingertips to use in protecting herself. This way, Lionel's mind could be as relaxed and stress-free as possible. Of course, flashing so far away was also the reason that Lionel was in such a poor state aside from the fact he had just fought a long and difficult battle. But there was no way he could allow Aina to be in danger of being found by that murderous woman while she was still in a critical state of meditation. The only reason she could enter such a state to begin with was because she had an implicit trust in Lionel. How could he do anything to let her down? Unfortunately, such a decision left him even more drained than he was previously, and now facing a battle he felt that he had no chance of winning. Lionel exhaled a breath, standing to his full height and stretching out his back. Pushing against the heavy gravity of this space made his muscles whine and his bones crack, but he still pushed through until he was at his full height. The gap is actually so large. If the gap between the Fiend class and the Chaos class is as exaggerated as the books in that library explained, then it likely means that I might not even be able to defeat a Chaos class existence at Tier 1, or even Tier 9 of the 5th dimension, for that matter. This was a huge problem, an enormous one. But Lionel wasn't sure how to easily fix it. To have the first-ranked Fire Force innate node should have placed him quite high on the talent totem pole, and that he was. The issue was that he couldn't use his forces as flexibly as Thela could. This was something that went beyond just techniques. Lionel was certain that while he was fighting Thela, she had only used a technique a single time, and that was when he first shot a fallen Star Force arrow. After that, she hadn't even used her ability index again. From beginning to end, aside from that one exception, she relied on nothing outside of her comprehension of force application. Lionel closed his eyes. He could feel it coming. Whatever demon they had prepared was probably looming over him right this moment. It was making it difficult even to breathe. But with every second he gained, his stars continued to rotate within his ethereal glabella and his force tried to recover as fast as it could. Lionel felt goosebumps racing across his skin and chilly air licking at his collarbone and neck. The temperatures seemed to be slowly falling step by step. At first it was subtle, but it soon reached a level that couldn't be ignored. The chill threatened to form crystals upon his body, slowly building layers onto his bronzed skin. However, Lionel's eyes remained closed, his body growing more and more relaxed, his nerves unwinding and his muscles becoming looser. Although he understood Aina's feelings, he was always the most comfortable like this. He was willing to sacrifice, to always stand before her no matter what danger lay ahead. If it wasn't because of the circumstances, he wouldn't have left her alone at all. Lionel took another breath and slowly exhaled, the frigid air making his teeth ache. However, the calmness of his expression only grew deeper. A dense auspicious air began to exude from him, his focus reaching another height. This world was nothing more than a 100 by 100 meter plot of plain land hanging in the depths of a foggy darkness. There was nothing here but him and an enemy. There was no space to run, nowhere to escape to. Unless he could win this battle, he would be finished. However, if he died, Aina would be left by herself to face the ire of the endless twilight pavilion. If he died, she would never be able to get revenge for her own mother. If he died, no one would be able to return to the human domain from this zone. Not his brothers, not Aina, not his mother. Victory was the only option. He hadn't separated from Aina because he had given up. In fact, it was quite the opposite. He had a time limit against Thela, but there was no such time limit against this creature. He would scratch and claw if he had to. Eventually, he would rip its final breath from its body with his own hands if he had to. Lionel's eyes opened, a serene coldness within them. Before him, no more than 3 inches away, a pair of reptilian eyes stared back. They were an ice-cold blue color and looked as though they had been carved out of sapphires. Their pupil slits were an abyssal black that seemed to swallow everything into an icy void. The demon had the body of a muscular human man but the head of a cobra, its neck flaring in and out with its every breath. It stood a full head taller than Lionel, its entire body covered in gorgeous sky-blue scales. Just its breath alone caused crystals to form in the air, its mighty, ancient presence weighing down the atmosphere as though its appearance alone was enough to multiply gravity several times over. This was a true fiend-class demon, its strength alone capable of toppling worlds. Bang! Lionel couldn't even see how the demon moved. In the blink of an eye, he found himself crashing against the barrier keeping him caged in this space. Chapter 1600. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 1600. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1600. How? Lionel coughed up a mouthful of blood, the action causing his cracked ribs to crackle like firecrackers, loosely rattling in his body. It was only now that Lionel understood he had been attacked by the blue cobra man's tail. It turned out its body wasn't entirely human after all. Lionel slid down the barrier, his coughing growing hoarser. Within such an enclosure, the advantages of being an archer weren't even that great. At any moment, he could at best be 100 meters away from this monster, a distance that was negligible to a demon with this level of strength. It was clear at a glance that this demon was a dual-strength and water-based one, giving it outstanding physical prowess and a supporting force that was able to form ice even upon Lionel's own powerful body. Lionel's feet hit the ground and he tried to push himself up. He wiped his lips, his gaze looking up to find that the cobra demon hadn't taken a single step forward. It kept staring at Lionel, a peculiar light dancing in its eyes. The personality of this demon was quite odd. Or, rather, it was the fact that this demon seemed to have a personality at all. The fact it took so long to attack Lionel in the first place was odd, but now it looked as though it was playing with its food. However, after seeing how weak Lionel was, the look in its eyes seemed to say that it had already grown bored. Its tail swished lightly. It was a casual action that hardly brought any sort of attention, and yet it formed an enormous 5-meter-long scythe that appeared before Lionel in an instant. So fast, Lionel couldn't understand how water force could be so fast. It wasn't known for such a thing, and this didn't seem to be a special sort of water force that had such properties either. If anything, the only property this water force had was an ice cold. Lionel's spear appeared in his hands and he struck out. Let the air burn. A blazing trail of fire followed his sweeping spear. Despite the short phrase, it represented something he embodied all too well. When it came to fire control of fire, there was no one that was his match. Bang! Lionel's spear nearly fell out of his hands, his body being blasted against the barrier once more. His shattered ribs rattled and his jaw clenched, the pain making his eyes go red. Lionel thought he stopped the attack, but it remained persistent, wrapping around his body like a death grip. Lionel quickly summoned his divine armor, hoping to mitigate the cold. But the seeping ice lodged into its jointed, slowing his movements to the point he felt he might truly be frozen solid at any moment. Without a choice, Lionel dispersed his divine armor. Somehow this water force was even more poisonous than it was fast. The moment it sensed the water force of his divine armor, it latched on and began to eat at it. If Lionel had been a second slower, he would have lost all ability to move. In that moment, it had even felt like his divine armor wasn't even his own any longer. Lionel's expression flickered. He just couldn't understand. In just a few seconds, this demon had used his force like a domain, and then it had displayed speed it shouldn't have, followed by leeching abilities that it should have. Although it took a small moment, Lionel had already recognized the water force. It was barely ranked top 30 amongst water forces, and it was known as Misty Frost Force. It was known for two things: its ability to quickly take the form of a vapor and its dense cold. However, it shouldn't have such a range of abilities. This was already the second time in just as many battles that he had run into such a thing. And now that he thought about it, others of this zone had displayed such wide-ranging applications for seemingly narrowly applicable forces as well. It was just that they had been too weak for Lionel to care or even take notice. Before Lionel could think any further, the Cobra Demon took just a single step forward and somehow crossed the distance in the blink of an eye. Lionel's eyes widened, his arms shooting upward and using his spear's body to block the coming tail. He barely made it in time, but his block integrity was far too weak, causing his own spear to smash against the side of his body and send him flying outward once again. Bang! Lionel's brows shot up. This didn't make any sense. Even his internal sight couldn't seem to keep up, but his mind was the strongest thing he had. Now that he thought about it, even Thila's thinking speed seemed faster than his own. He had ignored it previously because he felt that this was what she gained as someone who could control Dream Force. But now this demon seemed to also be able to outpace his thoughts. What's going on? Bang! Lionel collided with another barrier, his body immediately flopping to the ground. This time when he coughed, shards of bone and pieces of flesh followed suit. His blood was so dense and dark that it almost looked black. The kind of pain his body was experiencing was enough to make him want to pass out, anything to avoid the pain. However, he couldn't. If he did, it would really be over. Lionel grit his teeth. His mind couldn't focus, and any calculations he made seemed to become wildly inaccurate. He had already experienced this with Thila, but now it felt even more potent. There was no doubt that this demon was several times more powerful than her. Lionel's eyes widened, his pupils constricting into pinholes. A spark ripped through his dreamscape and he immediately understood. Time Force. That was much too similar to Time Force. But this demon doesn't control Time Force at all. How is this possible? Chapter 1601. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 1601. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1601. Byte displaying the abilities of a domain, displaying speed it shouldn't have, poisonous abilities it shouldn't have, outpacing his mind at the same dimension, and now even displaying the effects of a completely different force entirely. Lionel dove out of the wave, but he was still too slow. While he managed to avoid the Cobra Demon's punch, it was as though it had managed to predict exactly where he was going. It was a stupid choice, maybe the most idiotic choice Lionel had ever made. He had been thrust against one wall and then slapped to the side until he hit another one. With the Cobra Demon now coming straight at him, there was only one way to dodge, and that was to his right. To his left there was a barrier, coming straight at him was the Cobra Demon, and the only open space was right there. But if he could realize this, how could the Cobra Demon not? The demon's tail whipped across Lionel's face. At that moment, Lionel smelled the scent of death closer than he ever had before. There was no instant recovery to rely upon, there was no chance at clearing this zone, and there was no escape. His head snapped back and his spine cracked. His skull fractured, his brain rattling about and tearing under strong G-forces that it wasn't equipped to handle even in the sixth dimension. His jaw, nose, and teeth all cracked at once, leaving his face in an unrecognizable, bloody mess. Lionel entered a dazed-like state, and the fraction of a moment this took seemed to be stretched into infinity. He could practically feel his body shutting down, the reserves of his life force speeding out of his pores and back into the universe that had gifted it all to him. The pain came all at once and so forcefully that he actually didn't feel a thing. It was hard to tell if it was because his spine had entered an unrepairable state or if this was just the numbing that came with such a lingering scent of death. In those moments, Lionel's thinking speed, which had felt like it was running through sludge all this time, finally picked back up. But that only made him more aware of his impending demise. Shit, he couldn't understand how he made such a stupid mistake in battle. But it was even worse that he couldn't even think of an alternative. Meeting the Cobra Demon head-on was impossible, the gap between them was far too large. Every time it attacked him, its strength seemed to increase. But Lionel knew that the truth was that the Cobra Demon hadn't attacked all out from the very beginning. It was just toying with him. And now, it was bored. It simply didn't feel the need to hold back anymore. Lionel was furious. Furious with Thela, furious with the bastards that had forced the Void Palace into such a situation, furious with himself. The one time he didn't overestimate himself, the one time he wanted to obediently accept a loss, take what he could get and go home, the one time he pressed his own desires down and didn't pursue the position of number one, he had actually ended up in such a state. He didn't want to fight this battle, he never wanted to fight this battle. He wanted to protect the life of his mother, of Aina, of his brothers, and he had felt that the only way to do that was to lay down his pride and focus on maximizing his chances at survival. But even when he did this, he had somehow ended up like this. Bang! Time seemed to finally catch up with Lionel's speed of thought, and his body was slapped back to the corner he had tried to roll out from. His head rebounded against the barrier and his fractured skull directly shattered on impact. Lionel slid down the barrier, his eyes half open to reveal nothing but their whites. His limbs went limp and his body ceased movement. His face was nothing more than a rain of mangled flesh and blood, his limbs were twisted into odd angles and he seemed to have not the slightest sign of life left. Like a candle that had been snuffed out beneath a harsh, cold and suffocating wind, he sat dully, his head hanging, his legs spread and his arms limp. The frosty cold of the Cobra Demon latched onto his skin and blood. With nothing to fight back against it, he quickly gained patches of frost here and there, some on his face, some on his limbs, others on his torso, but each of them spreading like a blooming flower. The Cobra Demon gripped Lionel's neck and pulled him upward. An odd crunching sound followed as the shifting of Lionel's weight forced his cracked spine to crack once again. The tongue of the Cobra Demon slithered out, a hint of surprise coloring its snake-like face. It wasn't very interested in Lionel's corpse, at least not originally. But when the scent of Lionel's blood permeated the air, it made it feel quite intoxicated. Saliva dripped down from the Cobra Demon's teeth. What a boon. It hadn't expected such a weakling to have such tasty blood. Maybe if he might gain a small change at evolving to become a chaos demon. The Cobra Demon's mouth opened wide, its excitement palpable. Its saliva overflowed, but when it hit the ground, it froze into a puddle of ice. And then, the demon chomped down. A sickening crunch resounded. The Cobra Demon took a bite right out of Lionel's skull, swallowing half of it in a single gulp. It chewed slowly, its body trembling with delight as it savored every bite and swallowed. Once it did, completely beside itself, it roared with excitement, feeling as though every cell in its body had completely come alive. Its eyes turned red with excitement. When it lowered its head to take another bite, its saliva falling even faster, its gaze flashed. There, where Lionel's frontal cortex should be, a glimmer of a gem lay. Lionel's ethereal glabella. Chapter 1602. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 1602. If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1602 Overlord. It was large, abnormally large. Of course, despite this, it was still barely about the thickness of 2 thumbs, but such a thing was already beyond what could be said for most humans. Ethereal glabellas didn't grow in size. Even when Lionel was facing off against enormous oceanic creatures, he had a hard time pinpointing exactly where theirs were, and that was despite the fact that the beast crystals of beasts were innately several times larger than the ethereal glabellas of humans. Lionel's, though, was so large and bright that even in the mess of his sliced skull, it stood out. In fact, it seemed a bit different as well. Incredibly thin crimson threads spread out from it. They were hardly perceptible at all. If not for the cobra demon's sharp eyes, it wouldn't have spotted them at all. But they were just a slight shade redder than even Lionel's own blood. The thin crimson threads didn't spread very far, and couldn't even be considered a single centimeter long each. They seemed to both fuse with Lionel's ethereal glabella and act as a separate existence altogether. But from time to time, they would shift and form into shapes and curves that were simply impossible to understand. In that state, they looked less like threads and more like delicate and thin carvings. The cobra demon was enraptured. Much like humankind's love of refining demons, demons also loved to eat and refine humans. But the truest delicacy was most definitely the ethereal glabella. Only chaos demons could form them, as such lower-level demons were only good for their flesh. But absorbing powerful ethereal glabellas, especially for fiend-class demons so close to the chaos realms, was especially good. The cobra demon definitely felt like it had hit the jackpot. Originally, it thought its path of evolution was over after these humans caught it and forced it to be a ringleader for these pathetic little juniors. But with such an opportunity before it, how could it not be ecstatic? If before it wasn't certain, it was sure now that so long as it swallowed and completely refined Lionel, it would finally take that step it had been dreaming of for so long. Its manipulation of force had already reached the greatest extent it could. If it wanted to, before it had been captured by these humans that is, it could have broken into the 7th star whenever it wanted. But it was unwilling to. The 6th star was considered to be the true start of a practitioner's journey. It was the dividing line between those who could truly become powerful and those that would forever wallow in mediocrity. If it entered the 7th star without changing its class, the difficulty of doing so in the future would be exponentially more difficult. It had originally regretted its unwillingness. If it had broken through earlier, it would have been too powerful for the humans to use for this test, so it would have avoided such a fate. And now, it couldn't break through even if it wanted to. But to think that it would gain such a boon. If it broke into the chaos class, the seal placed on it would become useless. It could break into the 7th star in one go and shatter this cage. Once it entered the pinnacle of demon society, it would even have a chance to seek revenge for this day. The cobra demon trembled, reaching forward in an attempt to carefully pluck out Lionel's ethereal glabella. It was best to refine the entire body first. Once that was complete, he would be perfectly primed to refine this gem. But what the cobra demon couldn't have expected was that when it tried to pluck out Lionel's ethereal glabella, something that should have been easy, its claws were rebuffed. It pinched 2 sharp nails together, trying once again, but it was only rebuffed again. If it had a human face, it might have an incredulous sort of expression right this moment. Was it the crimson threads? Lionel was definitely dead. His heart had stopped, his skin had already begun to lose its warmth, and his entire body held not the slightest ounce of tension. It was definitely impossible for him to be doing this, so the only explanation was that these crimson threads and the odd runes they formed were doing something. The cobra demon was a genius that had pushed the use of its force to the absolute limit. In fact, it had started off as a human-class demon that diligently worked its way up to its current realm, a feat that took tens of thousands of years. When it came to pure talent, it wasn't nearly the best, as its innate affinity was for a mere water force barely in the top 30. However, when it came to its application and its use, it was on a completely different level. So when it saw itself being rebuffed for the 2nd time, it took a moment to sense exactly what was happening and came to a conclusion. This was a sealing-type force, an extraordinarily strong one. However, this seal was latched onto this body. So long as this body didn't exist anymore, the seal would also fall. It was no doubt a very heavy blood force seal, one more powerful than any it had ever seen before. It was clear that the parents of the cub should be very powerful. They would definitely be enraged about his death. The cobra demon knew it would have to escape as quickly as possible, then. Realizing what had to be done, the demon began chomping away at Lionel's body. Every sickening crunch represented another piece that vanished. One arm, both arms. One leg, both legs. The demon didn't dare to eat around Lionel's skull anymore, not until it refined enough of Lionel's body that the seal would lack the blood force necessary to lash out. To the demon's astonishment, it actually found not one, but two innate nodes in Lionel's body, one of which was a legendary 9th star innate node, and the other of which was a 5th star innate node. This alone was shocking enough, but the force that was inside shook it to its core. How? How could it have such great luck? The demon held both innate nodes in its hands. When it completely refined Lionel and evolved, it would have the perfect foundation to take these innate nodes as its own. While Miguel wasn't able to perfectly assimilate with it due to the Luxnix family's crude methods, it would be able to use Lionel as a catalyst for its perfect fusion with these two innate nodes. Like this, it wouldn't just become a normal chaos demon, in the future. It would become an overlord. Chapter 1603. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 1603. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1603. To Ash, the cobra demon's neck flared open and closed, its excitement clear in its crystalline blue eyes. Although fire force was maybe the force that it was the least compatible with, this should ironically help with its breakthrough. The penultimate realm one could reach in their force, a step that the cobra had yet to reach itself, was to birth one's opposite upon reaching an extreme, while the ultimate realm was to revert back once more. These were concepts that Lionel had no idea about, and they were things that the demon had only learned itself after countless thousands of years. The demon felt that it was still several steps away from this penultimate level, but if it could suddenly grasp the exact opposite of its own force to such a high level and even be able to meditate on these complete star runes, it would finally make a breakthrough. With such a breakthrough, even if it didn't become a chaos-class demon and even if it stayed in the 6th star, it would still become several folds more powerful, maybe even dozens of folds. The demon clutched the two innate nodes, looking toward what remained of Lionel's corpse with a hint of fondness that seemed completely out of place. One would have thought that it was looking at its own child rather than a meal that was half completed. When it made it settle its emotions and regained its calm, it continued to eat. Up Lionel's torso, savoring the tenderness of his lungs and sweetness of his heart. The demon had never had a human that tasted so good. Most of its life, it could only cannibalize its own kind. But demon flesh was very hard to eat, which was why humans refined it. Too much was lost in the process. But human bodies, even ones as tough as Lionel's, were so soft and tender by comparison, and that was especially since a corpse couldn't possibly activate bronze runes. They were an exceptional delicacy and one that demonkind couldn't get enough of. When the demon had finished eating through Lionel's neck, jaw and much of his face, leaving nothing much more than what remained of his brain, it couldn't help but sigh. It wanted to eat more, to savor more. Unfortunately, there was only one Lionel here. No, that wasn't true. Once it refined this and became a chaos demon, it would be powerful enough to target those truly monstrous humans and strengthen itself. And since it would have been an evolved chaos demon, it wouldn't be stuck behind the seal either, so there would be little to nothing the humans could do about it. It would be too powerful. In truth, the only chaos demons running around this world now were the very few that had escaped the fate of being sealed, and the ones like this fiend-class demon that evolved on their own after the event of all those years ago. Of course. The humans had no idea about this. While they were fighting full-blown wars against the demon bubbles, the great families, the supposed defenders of humanity, were hardly fighting any battles at all. It was all a great joke. They consolidated their power based on what they had supposedly done and were currently doing for humans, when the reality was that they did nothing at all but live lives of luxury. Of course, this wasn't entirely the case. There were still some chaos demons they had to keep in check, and they dealt with most demons like it ahead of time before they could evolve. It definitely wasn't a coincidence that it of all demons had been captured like this. It was a method of getting rid of future problems. But for the most part, the great families rested on their laurels. And now that they finally faced a problem they felt they might not easily be able to deal with, rather than doing their job as the protectors of humanity, the job they were paid so handsomely for, whether via tributes, respect, or power, they instead chose to hold such an event instead. They planned to wrangle together some useful talents they could use as cannon fodder so that they'd once again be able to survive while putting in a minimum amount of effort. Humans were truly pathetic. The Cobra demon sneered. Clearly it had a great amount of intelligence to piece all of this together. But how much of it was true and how much of it was just its distaste and bias against those that had hunted it down for its whole life, that much was unknown. The Cobra demon carefully ate around what was left of Lionel's brain. Piece by piece, it swallowed them down. Just as it had expected, the movements of the small crimson threads became slow and they even became dimmer. By the time there was nothing at all left of Lionel but his ethereal glabella, the crimson threads had no movement left whatsoever, falling into a dormant state and even losing their crimson color, becoming a lifeless black. The demon caressed the small ethereal glabella. As it sat in meditation, its stomach churned and its body quickly refined Lionel piece by piece. A relentless wave of power flooded through it again and again in tall tsunamis. Its cells and its blue scales shone with a vibrant color. And then, for the first time in over 10,000 years, its scales actually began to shed. Every shed cycle the Cobra demon went through, the strength of its body would actually more than double. It couldn't believe that such a weak human had given it such an evolution before it even entered the Chaos Demon realms. The more perfect its Fiend class body, the stronger its Chaos class body would be. This couldn't have come at a better time. The Cobra's tongue flickered in and out, its sapphire eyes glowing like two blazing torches. And then, it swallowed Lionel's ethereal glabella, entering an absolutely focused state. Its body couldn't be more primed and ready right at this moment. Boom! The aura of the demon began to skyrocket, its power advancing by leaps and bounds as it rushed toward the Chaos Demon realms. Its body bulged and shrank in a continuous cycle, its muscle fibers doubling and its organs shining with a resplendent light. What the demon didn't know, though, was that its actions of pushing Lionel through the gates of death and finally and truly awakened the latter's soul, a state that only the spirituals could experience, a race of people that built their own bodies. Within the demon's stomach, Lionel's ethereal glabella flashed. Life steal. Instant recovery. The demon, who had been sitting on the edge of ecstasy, suddenly froze. A strong pulling force latched onto its circulatory system, ripping at its blood and swallowing it by the tens of liters. The demon's recovery abilities made up this blood in an instant, but the suction only increased. At first it thought that this was part of its evolution, but it was then that it realized that it could no longer feel its connection with Lionel's ethereal glabella. In fact, the two innate nodes that it had set aside to fuse with later, suddenly shot into the air, rushing toward it and stabbing two holes in its stomach. The demon roared with fury, realizing that there was definitely a problem. It had always been quick on its feet and extremely intelligent. If not for this, it would have never made it so far and been so persistent. Without hesitation, it pierced a claw into its belly, ripping its stomach sac out and throwing it a long distance from itself. The demon's scales became somewhat pale and its aura plummeted, but even still, it only fell from the quasi-7th star to tier 3 of the 6th star. However, it wasn't paying attention to this at all, its blue eyes having become red with fury as it watched a blob of flesh quickly reform amidst a pillar of gold light. Even its stomach sac was absorbed and used to reform the naked body of a familiar young man. Lionel fell about a foot from the air, his face pale and his limbs still trembling. He had felt every second of himself being eaten alive. It was a feeling that made his body vibrate from head to toe. He gripped his fists, his lips far more blue than red and his hair far more white than violet. Even his dimension had dropped from the 6th back down to the 5th. He raised his head, meeting the gaze of the Cobra demon. At that moment, the Cobra demon, who was furious in its own right, trembled. The fury in Lionel's eyes drowned out its own. Fueled by humiliation, Lionel's rage seemed to want to burn the world to ash. Chapter 1604. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 14 seconds AM. Chapter 1604. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1604. Spiritual. Lionel's body felt like it was breaking apart. It felt like he was a normal mortal man once again and that he hadn't eaten or had anything to drink in weeks. Not only was his skin pale, his heartbeat was incredibly fast as it tried to move around the limited blood in his body, and his skin practically stuck to his bone. He had gone from someone who had more defined muscles and vascularity in a lean frame than most bodybuilders had in their behemoth-like bodies, to a walking, breathing skeleton. Though, even breathing hurt, so the latter might not even be true for very much longer. The furious light in his eyes was almost like the smoldering flames of an undead, his sunken features making him look like he was a step away from death. The state of the Cobra demon couldn't be considered to be much better. Lionel had left it in a terrible state. Even after taking so much of its blood, he had barely had enough to reform his body. It was clear that the gap in talent between Lionel and the fiend-class demon was actually enormous. If not for this, how could the latter drop down 6 tiers, and yet Lionel could still hardly stand. In fact, he hadn't even been able to maintain his 6th-dimensional status. The Cobra demon should have been able to heal an injury as simple as a lost stomach almost instantly. And yet it still stood hunched over in the distance, its eyes and tongue flickering as it kept its gaze locked onto Lionel. It was clear that it could seem to heal. However, lingering energies from its near breakthrough into the Chaos Demon realms was still there. It just needed time to recover, and there was about a 10% chance it could still manage to make that final breakthrough. However, when facing the smoldering fury in Lionel's eyes, its senses were primed to an extreme, its scales rippling as they moved up and down. It couldn't even think about a breakthrough right now. It had never seen someone capable of regenerating to such an extent. Even demons, who were especially known for their recovery abilities, couldn't do such a thing. Could it be that this boy had that soul separation ability it had heard about? But no, that still shouldn't be possible. Those with that ability needed to take over other bodies. They didn't even have ethereal glabellas, as their souls were vessels capable of replacing the function of one. As such, their very essence could be moved from place to place. It was possible to create a body for oneself if you had such an ability, but as a human, your ability to do so would be very much lacking in comparison to spirituals. This was because a spiritual could take raw materials and use their powerful souls to mold it into their image. However, one with this ability wouldn't necessarily have a soul powerful enough to do this. In addition, even if they did, they would lack the refinement techniques of the spirituals. As such, you would only be able to use crude clone creation methods like Era. But such clones would only last a few years at best before you would have to create a new one. Could it be that this boy was a spiritual? One that had used the raw materials of its very own body in order to reform his? When the Cobra demon thought to this point, its body shuddered and its level of seriousness raised by several levels. It wasn't a fool. Lionel didn't have the aura or smell of a spiritual. However, when it thought about the fact that Lionel had 2 innate nodes of the number 1 fire force in all of existence, it overrode all of its other thoughts. Theoretically, if a spiritual wanted to, they could construct a body with a human aura. In fact, now that the Cobra demon thought about this, wasn't this a human lead trial for youths? Could it be that this genius of the spirituals had masked his real identity in order to sneak in and partake in the secrets of the demons? The spirituals should be far more powerful than humans, though. Was it even necessary to do such a thing for someone of Lionel's caliber? However, the Cobra demon didn't bother to think so far. Every race had its own internal conflict. For a spiritual like this boy to have such poor force control and comprehension, it definitely meant that he had been ostracized by his people. A genius of this level should be able to wipe it out with a single wave of a palm, but clearly this boy could not. Plus, if it treated Lionel like a spiritual genius, it wouldn't lose out. In fact, its caution would only help it. Until now, it had only been toying with the boy, not bringing out even a small fraction of its strength. But now, it would go all out. The temperature plummeted and then plummeted once again. The pit in the demon's torso became a block of ice, freezing over all the leaking blood and stopping it in its tracks. The cobra demon reached out into seemingly empty space. But at that moment, fine lines of cracks in space appeared and its hand vanished, leaving only its forearm in sight. With it pulled back, a menacing weapon slowly manifested inch by inch. It carried with it the wild fluctuations of space. A scythe that looked as though it had been carved of black ice made its presence known. Everywhere it swept by, space froze over and cracked. It curved with a murderous aura, blue frost wafting from its body. The cobra demon rose to its full height, roaring into the skies above. Bang! It shot forward like a streak of blue light. Lionel was the only thing it could see. This boy was the gate between it and freedom, between it and true power. Spiritual or not, it would make sure that this boy felt its pride as a demon. Chapter 1605. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 14 seconds AM. Chapter 1605. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1605. Demon Blood. The cobra demon appeared before Lionel in the blink of an eye. The smoldering fire within the latter's eyes as sharp as blades. Lionel took a step to the side, dodging out of the way of the blade. He felt like he could finally see again. The slush his mind had been wading through was nowhere in sight. No. It was still there, it was just far less capable of affecting him any longer. He could finally think like himself, finally calculate like himself, finally make the world dance in the palm of his hand like himself. A spear appeared in his hand as the scythe sliced down a mere inch from his nose. He didn't have the strength to manifest his panda construct. His body was too weak to summon his bronze runes. He couldn't summon his stars. The pressure he had put on his mind previously to save Aina was far too much, and it only became worse after his soul separated from his body and lost its support. The only things that hadn't abandoned him was his ability index, his innate nodes, and this spear in his hand. His gaze blazed. This was more than enough. Scarlet star force flooded Lionel's body from his left kidney. At this moment, he was thankful that he hadn't shattered the seals upon it to the 6th-dimensional level. With the current state of his body, there was no way that it could handle 6th-dimensional scarlet star force. Flames blazed to life around him. He had never been more focused. His spear pierced outward, taking claim of the absolute perfect timing. The gaze of the cobra demon flickered. It was surprised by Lionel's sudden increase in reflexes. What happened? However, it didn't care. It had already approached with the utmost caution. As for these scarlet star force flames, how could they possibly hurt it with such a crude, rudimentary usage? The scythe of the cobra demon flipped in its palms, changing the direction of its blade and slicing toward Lionel's back despite the fact that the demon stood before him. The hook of the blade was fully prepared to cut Lionel at the waist, but the latter didn't even seem to notice in the slightest. Destruction runes flashed in Lionel's smoldering pupils, the blade of his own blade shifting and perfectly colliding with the polearm of the scythe. It looked like a completely useless action, but the small force was enough to carry a bit of extra momentum over to the scythe blade. The demon's original strike had been a downward swing, so now it was actually pulling its scythe upward to deal Lionel a blow. Lionel's sudden and unpredictable actions caused the demon to overshoot, the hook of its scythe just barely grazing the tips of his hair. The demon faltered in its step backward, not having received the resistance it had expected from slicing through Lionel's waist. Due to its caution, it had actually expected Lionel to be able to block this attack, somehow, some way, but what it hadn't expected was for destruction runes to flash in Lionel's eyes for a mere parrying maneuver. Lionel was already moving forward. His spear spun in his hand, a wheel of flames forming as he used a technique he hadn't in a very long time, Infernal Cyclone. All he could do now was use these simple techniques he had gained from Valiant Heart Mountain, but in his eyes, they would be more than enough. He regretted it. He regretted ignoring his heart and not shooting for first place, for scrounging for what he could instead of ripping away what he wanted. A wheel of fire shot forward. Powered by Lionel's Scarlet Star Force, it tore the ground apart, rushing forward like the wheels of a blazing race car as it closed the small distance between Lionel and the stumbling cobra demon in an instant. Lionel's spear spun once again, forming another wheel and closing the distance. Due to its miscalculation, the Cobra Demon's scythe wasn't in place to block or counter. It could only remove a hand from its polearm and slammed out with a claw. Meteoric impact. Lionel didn't miss a single beat. Even as the wheels of fire shattered into a rain, he took a strong step forward and he pierced through the fires with a deathly momentum. His spear appeared before the Cobra Demon, but shocking enough, it wasn't toward any one of its vital points like the demon had expected, but rather right into the block of ice that had blocked up its stomach. The Cobra Demon was smart enough to consider that Lionel might use the first attacks as a cover. Lionel had already done it once, it was very possible that he'd do it again. But it thought that Lionel would attack one of its vital points, not a block of ice. Although it was an injury, it wasn't life-threatening. As a fiend-class demon, even if it didn't heal it, it would easily survive for decades without its stomach. It just didn't make sense for Lionel to attack such a thing. The tip of Lionel's spear barely pierced the ice, however this was where the effects of meteoric impact activated. Bang! An implosion of fire blasted from the inside out. The Cobra Demon's eyes widened, coughing up a mouthful of blood as it was blasted backward. Lionel's battle intent blazed as a tempest of flames rose up around him. Harmonic spear. His voice was frighteningly cold. At that moment, hundreds of flame clones, each wielding a fiery spear, appeared in the skies. The plummeting temperature began to skyrocket. Even if Lionel couldn't win by quality, he would win by quantity. He still couldn't understand how this Cobra Demon was so powerful, even using spatial abilities when it clearly didn't have such an affinity, but none of that mattered. All he wanted right now was for his blade to taste blood. Demon blood. His clones all pierced out at once. Chapter 1606. Published at 3rd of February 2023 8:24 and 14 seconds AM. Chapter 1606. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1606. Chaos Demon. The Cobra Demon's body rebounded against the barrier even as Lionel's clones all pierced forward at once. It coughed violently again and again. Lionel's spear was hardly strong enough to pierce its block of ice, which went to show just how sturdy it was. However, this was precisely its downfall. Lionel had used its own force against it, using it as materials for his makeshift grenade. Right now, shards of the Cobra Demon's own ice had torn into its lungs, its intestines, and most unfortunately, its heart. With how slow its regenerative abilities were now, such a thing was a death sentence unless it could find something to nourish itself. But would Lionel allow it such an opportunity? It felt that the moment Lionel had reformed his body, it had entered quicksand it couldn't find its way out of. It found that its suppression of Lionel, at least toward the latter's mind, was of no use at all. And now that Lionel's mind was unleashed in full force, it couldn't keep up with his deductions, and it couldn't read Lionel's intentions any longer. The Cobra Demon faced this rain of fire with a look of unwillingness in its eyes. How far had it climbed to reach this point? Now it was just a single step from its goal, a single step away from becoming the chaos-class monster it had always wanted to be, but now it was going to be snatched from it at the finish line? No. 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 The neck of the Cobra Demon flared, its mouth opening wide. It pushed itself up, a wild mist of frost billowing around it. Die. 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 Lionel's clones shattered one after another, the dissipation of one leading to a large impact on the Cobra Demon's wild flurry of force. However, Lionel's expression only remained as cold as ever. When it came to stamina, none could match up to an innate node holder, never mind the state the demon was in. This demon was only hastening its death. Lionel's spear spun, releasing infernal clone after infernal cyclone. Bright red gold wheels shot through the dull ground, grinding the Cobra Demon down step by step. His spear pierced outward. If he could also use Vanishing Blade, he could have already ended this battle. But it was impossible for him to manipulate space in his current state, especially not with the crude methods of a technique of Valiant Heart Mountain. Bang! 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 Roar! The Cobra Demon ignored everything, not even protecting itself as it started a mad charge toward Lionel. Although it had seemed that it could casually deal with Scarlet Star force, that was all. The Cobra Demon controlled a mere top 30 water force at the 6th dimension, while Lionel controlled the number 1 fire force at the 5th dimension. The former was able to use its expert control and understanding of its force to make the latter seem useless, but as it ran out of stamina, it became harder and harder. So it ignored everything, conserving what was left of its stamina to charge through Lionel's wall of fire. By the time it came out of the other side, it was nothing but a blazing humanoid, its scales, body and flesh quickly charring under in the inferno. It swiped at Lionel with its scythe. However, Lionel only flicked out with his spear. Crack! In its madness, the Cobra Demon had forgotten what its scythe was formed out of. Now that it had abandoned all forms of protection, how could the scythe continue to maintain its structural integrity? The shards of ice sparkled as they fell through the air. Time seemed slow, the rain of ice twinkling beneath the raging red-gold flames as Lionel's spear continued its forward sweep, piercing right through the demon's heart. With its scales quickly being destroyed, how could its defenses still be the same? The Cobra Demon fell to its knees before Lionel, blazing in a pillar of fire. Its head raised, laughing into the skies. All that effort, tens of thousands of years, countless battles, all to fall here. However, at the very least, this vile human wouldn't gain its body. It would rather burn to ash right here in a final blaze of glory. Just as it was about to fall, though, Lionel reached through the flames and grabbed its neck, squeezing down hard. He looked down at the Cobra Demon, meeting its gaze through the raging fires. Did I say that you could die as you pleased? Your corpse is too valuable. Don't you like to eat people? I'll make sure to savor you well. The flames that the Cobra Demon found to be impossible to deal with any longer suddenly vanished into wisps of smoke as though they had never been there, leaving behind a half-dead, charred demon. As the final embers of its life flickered out, the Cobra Demon couldn't pull its gaze away from Lionel's. Just, which of them was the demon, exactly? Standing there, as sickly as could be, with barely the strength to even stand, Lionel still somehow felt like a monster it shouldn't have dared to stand against. At that moment, outside the battlegrounds of Top 10 versus Demon, the sound of shrieking resounded through the demon world. By this point, 9 of the top 10 had already exited, leaving Lionel as the only one left. 2 of these top 3 had joined up with Thela as they were members of the Endless Twilight Pavilion. However, right this moment, all 3 were in a bloody mess. Their clothes were shredded to pieces, their tender bodies an unrecognizable, bloodied mess, and all of their lofty arrogance had shrunk to nearly nothing. Demon! Thela shrieked. You're not a blood sovereign, you're a demon. Demon! Demon! She seemed to have completely lost her mind, unable to even speak in coherent sentences. Before her, a beauty of unspeakable proportions stood. The white of this beauty's eyes had turned completely black, her irises looking like a pool of blood. On her back, at the level of her hips, a pair of black wings grew out where her Venus dimples would have been. Above her head, there was a jet black halo, and out from her tailbone, there was an incredibly thin and sharp tail that grew out like a menacing whip. A twin pair of horns curved out from her forehead, sparking with black lightning from time to time. Her body was wrapped in floating black feathers that circulated around her, making it difficult to tell if she was wearing clothes at all. The hints of skin such an appearance revealed was enough to intoxicate all those who saw her, including even women. It was you. You drove him to such a state. You deserve a life worse than death. A woman by Thela's side crushed a talisman. This was already her 10th time doing so, but she kept trying again and again. Master. Master. Chaos demons have infiltrated the Fiend class sect. Just then, the tail of the Chaos demon whipped outward and a pink tongue flashed into the air, spinning about before plopping to the ground. This Chaos demon swept a sorrowful gaze forward that quickly became frighteningly cold as though she was thinking of other methods to torture these 3. This Chaos demon was none other than Aina Brazinger. Chapter 1607. Published at 6th of February 2023 7:46 and 15 seconds AM. Chapter 1607. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1607 LSLTU. Lionel fell out of the air, landing on the ground with a stumble. His lungs felt like they were filled with sand at this point. If it wasn't because he had a decent amount of strength in his healthy form, he wouldn't have nearly enough energy left in this state to drag around a fiend-class demon. Lionel's gaze turned in a certain direction. Over there, a huge pillar of baleful lights swirling in crimson and black, swirling like a cyclone. The aura was more powerful than anything he had experienced before in this demon world, so much so that even in this state, he could feel it. It had to be understood that right now, Lionel's couldn't even use his internal sight properly, at least not to his normal exaggerated ranges. When he fought the Cobra demon, he had focused all the Dream Force stamina he had left in his ability index so that he would be able to calculate a path to victory, and that he did. But right now, since he didn't need to fuel his ability index to its very peak, he was able to use his internal sight to a small extent. But even then, it was just barely in a 100-meter radius. If others heard Lionel calling 100 meters a small radius for his internal sight, they would be greatly shocked. But truthfully, wasn't a 100 meters small compared to the over 100 kilometers Lionel was usually capable of? Even his starry spirit domain had had a range 100 times that, and it was on a level all to its own. That pillar was at least 20 kilometers away from Lionel, though, and yet he could still sense it so clearly. He hadn't even initially been facing that way and could have easily missed it considering his languid state, but it was as though it demanded his attention. Lionel's brow furrowed. This aura wasn't one he recognized, but the coercion laced through it was something he had only ever felt from Aina. When Aina first rid herself of her curse, she had gained a coercion ability that she found difficult to control. Just by existing, her charm could practically enslave the minds of others. When she spoke, her words carried a beauty all to their own. The mental pressure she placed on most was simply on another level. Even Lionel was somewhat affected. Of course, this was also because Lionel had very deep feelings for Aina to begin with. Normally, such coercion wouldn't work on him at all. Lionel didn't know exactly what happened between his and Aina's separation, and their meeting once more. But by then, she had gained perfect control over her coercion and it never leaked again. In fact, she didn't even use it in battle. The last time she used it at all was under Lionel's request to sing a note to test something, resulting in them creating a powerful combination attack, an attack, without which, they wouldn't have been able to kill the first lower fiend-class demon they met in this world. It was thanks to defeating this demon that they gained a small foothold in this world to begin with. However, even after this, Aina seemed quite reluctant to use it. That said, Lionel never blamed her because he understood her feelings quite intimately. That experience Aina had on terrain was a heavy scar on her heart. She almost lost her life to the puppet master, and that was one thing that she could accept, but what the puppet master had wanted to do to her made her freeze up. The one dream Aina had outside of revenge for her mother was to have a large family, for her to bask in warmth she had never gotten a chance to experience as a child and live a happy life. Although Aina had originally wanted to keep a distance from Lionel when the metamorphosis descended, this wasn't because she hadn't had such hopes buried within her heart, but rather because she wanted to protect Lionel, a sentiment that waned somewhat the more of his talent he displayed, but never quite fully vanished. It could be said that of all of Aina's hopes, this was the one that ranked second of them all, but it was also the one that acted as the guiding light of her heart. While revenge might have been number one, there was only so much of such darkness a person could take. Why else would Aina want to have so many children? She really hadn't been joking that day. As many children as Lionel was willing to give her, was as many as she would birth. She wanted a family so large that she would never have to experience coldness again. And yet, that bright, beautiful hope within her heart, within her soul, was taken, twisted, darkened and perverted by the puppet master. Back then, it had really seemed like there would be nothing she could do. Her body was out of her control and she could only sit, shivering. However, due to a stroke of luck, she had been able to use the effect of her curse to escape. But then the bastard appeared again on Earth all while she was in one of her happiest moments with Lionel. The puppet master once again snatched control of her body away. Back then, Lionel hadn't understood Ana's thoughts and emotions so deeply, but he had understood enough to be infuriated. He didn't need to know the details. The fact that someone had made his Ana feel such a way was enough for him to sentence them to death. So, he dropped a city from the skies. Lionel had done everything he could, but since that day, Ana had been very hesitant to use her abilities as a blood sovereign, only feeling comfortable enough to when matters were related to Lionel. She had always hated them because of that lack of control she had experienced that day. "Is it you?" Despite only just thinking this, Lionel was already running in that direction. His lungs threatened to stop expanding no matter how hard he breathed, but he just kept running. No matter how weak he was now, 20 kilometers was still a small distance to him, and yet it took almost half an hour before he laid eyes on her. The moment he did, his body gave way. Chapter 1608. Published at 6th of February 2023 7:46 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1608. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1608. Someone Lionel's consciousness came in and out of focus. He was truly drained. Even his usually endless dream force was tapped out. The process of fully separating his soul from his body was definitely incredibly taxing, and it felt even much like something that shouldn't have happened at all. However, when that was stacked atop of what he had experienced before, it really pushed him over the edge. He had only managed to run so far out of sheer will, and he wasn't even 100% certain if what he expected to find on the other side would be that. However, before he could hit the ground, he found himself enveloped by a soft embrace. The moment Lionel appeared, Ana had sensed it immediately and rushed over. She seemed to blink away from her location, nothing but a tornado of black feathers being left as a marker for her former appearance. When she appeared once more, she had already caught Lionel. Those black feathers that had wrapped around her, dancing about in a pattern around her, was a defense the three women had become intimately familiar with. It was as though they couldn't pass through it no matter how hard they tried. However, at that moment, they didn't harm Lionel in the slightest, allowing his head to pass through as though they weren't there at all. Ana's expression flickered. Lionel looked so sickly and weak. The first emotion she felt with excitement, but then when she said his state she felt worry, and very soon that became an unbridled rage. Die! In her fury, her tail whipped out and shot through the skulls of the three women in one sweeping motion that was no less sharp than a flexible sword. As though a disc had run through their foreheads, their expressions froze in horror before their bodies plopped to the ground with a dull, wet sound. Ana held Lionel in her arms and shivered when she realized that he had actually fallen to the fifth dimension. Just what had happened to him? Her gaze landed on the demon he had been dragging behind him. Was it because of this demon? Her demonic eyes flickered with rage. She couldn't refine this demon to help Lionel. In his current state, there was no way that he could handle a force pill on this level. One had to remember just the kind of violent upheaval Lionel's body underwent whenever he swallowed these pills. Even in his peak state, it was like he swallowed a mountain and his digestive system was placed under a great amount of stress. Most importantly, it was mostly because of his Tier 4 control ability index that he was able to lower much of the risk. However, if he swallowed even a lower fiend class force pill in this state, he would end up ripping a hole through his body. It definitely wasn't an easy feat to improve your foundation. It needed one to have decent enough talent to begin with and a tremendous amount of focus. Lionel needed something more delicate to absorb. Ana's brows furrowed, but this didn't last too long. She placed a hand on Lionel's chest and a strong life force began to pulse. She reached out another hand toward the demon's corpse and it was quickly sucked dry before it began to be quickly refined. Ana's expression flickered. This demon looked like any other higher fiend class demon, but there was something different about its insides. It was actually on the verge of becoming a chaos class demon and it had even started the process, but for some reason it had halted. After thinking to this point, Ana thrust away all other distracting thoughts. By now, her skill in manipulating blood force had skyrocketed. Since Lionel could absorb it on his own, she would just have to break it down into bite-sized pieces he could absorb. It was as simple as that. Even the Aurora Black Panther's life-steal abilities were nothing compared to her. Lionel quickly began to regain some color. His skin gained some luster, no longer sticking to his bone. His white hair and eyes began to slowly regain their pale violet hues and the faint light they usually emitted. And his muscles returned inch by inch as though vegetation that had finally been watered. Lionel's consciousness, which had been fading in and out, regained some of its focus, his heart skipping a beat. Though it seemed like he had only lost consciousness just now, it was far worse than that. If not for someone's action, he would have died. His body was running on empty, and it could be said that the only thing still running was his soul. But once he ran out of dream force, wouldn't it also be running on empty? If his body and soul hit a wall, what was there left if not death? Both needed to be functioning properly for Lionel to hold on to his life. Normal humans of the human domain had their souls and bodies fused into one, so once the body died, the soul would die as well. Likewise, if one met a spiritual capable of targeting one's soul, death would also be the only path forward. However, the separation of Lionel's soul and body meant that he had some leeway. His body could be pushed to the brink of death and he would be able to bring it back with his soul. At the same time, his soul could be brought to the brink of death and he could use his body to bring it back. The only caveat was that his ethereal glabella had to remain intact. It was the link that chained the both. Without it, there was only death waiting for him. Wait, someone? Lionel started and his head shot up to final a demonic pair of eyes looking back at him. Its whites were completely black and the irises were entirely crimson. Aina, who hadn't been ready for Lionel to suddenly wake up, panicked, trying to hide her face. Chapter 1609. Published at 6th of February 2023 7:46 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1609. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1609 became. Lionel blinked. He looked Aina up and down, his gaze not giving much of his thoughts away. Horns? Black halo? Wings at waist level? A tail? Black feather tornado in place of clothes? Big, really big, soft breasts. Wait, those had already been there before. Lionel's gaze sparkled. First a vampire girlfriend, now a succubus girlfriend. Raj would be jealous enough to jump off the nearest cliff. Lionel laughed so hard that his voice boomed across the skies, much of his power seemingly having returned to his body. He almost immediately began to play with Aina's wings and tail, just to make sure they were real and that he wasn't dreaming. How had he hit such a jackpot? As for Aina's embarrassment, he couldn't even be bothered with it. Funny enough, the first time Lionel learned that Aina could absorb the blood of others, she had reacted like this as well, scared of how he would take it. Clearly, she hadn't learned her lesson. Lionel had two loves in life: cool uniforms and monster girls. He could already envision Raj's furious howl at the unfairness of it all. Aina squirmed, moving her hands from her face. Her wings and tail were exceptionally powerful in battle, but when Lionel touched them like that it made her feel odd sorts of stimulation she had never experienced before. Quickly, she retracted it all, running away from Lionel's touch. At that moment, the black feathers rotating around her and hiding much of her decency shrank and latched onto her skin, becoming a gorgeous black full-body armor that glided down the grace of her curves. If one looked closely, it almost looked as though she had forged this full-body flexible armor out of the scales of a mighty black dragon. Seeing Aina's tail, wings and horn all disappear at once, Lionel practically pouted. There should be laws against this kind of thing, he mumbled. Aina was truly speechless when she heard this, but she couldn't help but break out into a smile. As expected, the one who always made her feel the most comfortable in her skin was Lionel. Whether her face was scared, whether she could drink blood, whether she quite literally became a demon, he didn't even seem to care, nor did he ask how any of it had happened. He just continued to have that same childish grin on his face. If not for the crossroads they had reached those years ago, just how deep would their relationship be right now? She simply couldn't see herself with any other man. Stop playing around, I haven't finished healing you yet. Aina had barely managed to awaken Lionel. Even now, he was still quite sickly and had only regained enough energy to be somewhat lively, but not enough to return to his peak. Yes, Ma'am, Lionel obediently placed his head on Aina's lap as though this was some sort of punishment. Aina began the procedure once more, slowly nurturing Lionel step by step. Aren't you going to ask? Aina asked after a while. Ask about what? Lionel blinked. Aina rolled her eyes. Sometimes this man was truly too dense. Oh. You mean about the succubus mommy, I mean demon morphing thing? Lionel coughed. It just slipped out, truly. They weren't even his words, nor did he have such a fetish. It was just something that Raj had repeated so many times he had subconsciously blurted them out. He was in a delirious half-dead state, he deserved this kind of free pass. Aina burst into another fit laughter. I didn't know you had such hidden fetishes. I was actually planning to learn the whip as my next weapon, are you interested? Lionel was speechless for a moment before we recovered. I think between the both of us, we know who the real masochist is. Aina suddenly blushed profusely. She had never told Lionel that, did he just figure it out on his own? Of course, in the past, Lionel's mind hadn't been sharp enough to pick up on it. But with his impeccable memory and his strengthened mind, he could easily see through things he hadn't been able to see through before. In this arena, he was undefeated. However, what Aina didn't realize was that when Lionel said masochist, he was actually referring to Aina's training methods. But when she suddenly blushed like that, a spark went off in his dreamscape that he couldn't ignore. Huh? Lionel's brows shot up. Lionel was about to say something, but he found a firm hand had been placed over his mouth and a murderous glint in Aina's eye as she looked down at him. In the end, Lionel could only cough lightly and pretend as though he hadn't seen a single thing. But inwardly, he was grinning like a madman. It's the Silver Empire. HM. Lionel looked up to meet Aina's again. She had gone back to focusing on helping him heal, but she still began to talk. When I was with my dad, I entered a zone with the youths of the Three-Pillar sector. That was a remnant zone of the dead Silver Empire. It was incredibly dangerous and very distorted, and we almost died. However, inside, I was able to receive a legacy that I didn't really fully understand. When I was meditating on the Blood Sovereign gold tablet, though, I finally made a breakthrough and I understood something. The things that had confused me about the original legacy finally made sense and it all clicked. When I took the legacy out to confirm, I realized that I was underground and you weren't there anymore. But when I broke out from the earth to try and find you, the legacy began to frenziedly absorb the anarchic force in this demon world and it resonated with something within me. I hadn't expected it to happen, because according to the legacy, it was exceptionally tyrannical and should have been difficult to grasp even with my comprehension. But something triggered that made it all happen automatically. Before I could understand what happened, my body had completely changed and the first genius I ran into here ran away screaming, that I'd become a chaos demon. Lionel fell into silence. The Silver Empire? Chapter 1610. Published at 6th of February 2023 7:46 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1610. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1610. Silver Empire. Lionel kept hearing the name of this empire come up again and again. But oddly enough, the Void Palace hadn't had much information on it. One would think that one of the most powerful empires of the human domain would be well documented. After all, wasn't the point of the Void Palace to act as an alliance of humans? But if what Aina was saying was true, maybe it was the case that the Silver Empire was destroyed because of their connection to demons. This wasn't impossible considering the situation in this zone and how the two races seemed to be like fire and water. This would also explain why Lionel didn't understand anything about this zone despite the fact he believed it might be mythological. If the history of the Silver Empire was mostly erased outside of some vague information passed by word of mouth from time to time, then it was highly likely that any fairy tale this world was based on could have been erased as well, if for nothing other than to hide the connection. But there was a very glaring issue with all of this. If the Silver Empire could form chaos demons, Lionel didn't believe for a single second that the powers of the human domain could ever destroy them. Just from these last few weeks of interacting with fiend-class demons, Lionel realized just how large the gap was. If Lionel had to rank himself, he was probably somewhere between a middle and higher fiend-class demon in talent and strength, and he could use his mind and tricks to bridge the gap. Simply put, if the Silver Empire had been formed of a bunch of Lionels, how could the human domain have possibly destroyed them? Of course, Lionel thought of the possibility that they had actually been destroyed by another race, but he threw that idea out immediately. If another race infiltrated the human domain deeply enough to destroy the Silver Empire, why would the human domain even still exist at all? And even if Lionel was willing to accept that their only target was the Silver Empire and they left everyone else alone, that wouldn't explain why much of the Silver Empire's history had been wiped. The only thing that made sense was that the humans themselves wiped out the Silver Empire. But even that was lacking because the strength Lionel had seen humans display until now shouldn't be enough. In that case, it was likely a complex cobweb of internal strife and external pressure that led to their collapse. Things were rarely, if ever, just one-dimensional in their complexity, especially when the topic was real-world politics, powers, and organizations. There was also one more possibility that Lionel hadn't fully considered as well. Let's say that the Silver Empire really was able to access the strength of demons in all their glory and they also had little to no internal strife, or at the very least, not enough to cause them to collapse. How, then, would they have fallen to humans? It's very much possible that the core difference here isn't in being a demon, but rather force manipulation. Lionel's gaze flashed, a possibility coming to him. Why was it that he struggled so much against the Cobra demon? Of course that demon was very physically strong, but what really set it apart was its magnificent use of force. It took a fairly ordinary force and turned it into an insurmountable mountain Lionel couldn't even climb. Thankfully, dying had been the catalyst for Lionel's soul to separate from his body, resulting in his mind gaining a boost that made him immune to the demon's suppression of it. But that was ultimately the largest issue by far. From what Lionel had seen, though, the human domain didn't have such force manipulation abilities at all. Could it be, then, that the demons of the Silver Empire hadn't been as towering and undefeatable as the demons in this zone? If that was the case, things would make a little bit more sense and the humans might have been able to destroy the Silver Empire given enough willingness to sacrifice. There was a very easy method of telling, though. Lionel didn't really have to guess. How powerful are you now? Lionel asked. Considering Aina had killed those three, including Thela who Lionel couldn't do anything against, her strength should be very great. Don't overestimate me too much, Aina laughed lightly. I might have killed those three, but the truth is that there was a huge battle royale that broke out before you returned. Oh. Yes. A lot of the top 10 came out in quick succession, the gap between them was very small. So, obviously, those that lost out wanted to fight for the chance they lost out on. There was a huge battle in the center of the world and they all ended up heavily injured. Half of those injuries on them weren't even caused by me to begin with. They caught sight of me afterward when the fighting was finished. They thought the gap was large enough that they didn't have to worry about their injuries, but luckily they were wrong. Right now, I probably just caught up to you again. I didn't have enough time to meditate on the gold tablet anymore, but there should be a lot of room to improve. I've noticed that this world has a very unique method of using force that I still can't quite understand, do you? Lionel fell into silence hearing this question. First, Aina's words confirmed that she, and likely the Silver Empire, were unable to pull out the greatest strength of their demon bodies. That leaves a path for the humans to kill them. But secondly, it seemed that she had noticed what he had as well. I've been thinking about that too, and I think I probably have an answer, but it's really complicated. I'm not quite sure how to take the first step. But if I were to explain it as simply as possible. Why are weapon forces the only ones that can evolve? It's likely that all forces have an evolution path. Chapter 1611. Published at 6th of February 2023 7:46 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1611. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1611. Force manipulation. Aina's eyes lit up, but she didn't interrupt Lionel. But I also don't think it's that simple. There's a fundamental difference between weapon forces and other forces, and that's that weapon forces all start from the foundational dimension. Aina frowned. Didn't all forces do that? Lionel's Scarlet Star Force was the perfect example. If not, he wouldn't have to undo the seals step by step. If it was someone else, Aina would have probably interrupted, but Lionel wasn't someone who would make such a rudimentary mistake, so she just continued to listen. When you look at other forces, it feels like that happens as well, but it feels like a rubber band. Lionel chose this example after a while. The stronger the force, the tighter and thicker the rubber. It's harder to stretch, but it's also more resilient at greatest length. It also stores up more energy per length stretched. If you take a normal fire force and you compare it to Scarlet Star Force, the latter is the far thicker and more powerful rubber band, even right from the start. If you stretch it a single inch, and let's say that inch represents the third dimension, if I release it, which rubber band will fly further and have greater impact is obvious. But the starting point, from the very beginning, is different. For some forces, if you stretch it past a certain point, rather than producing more powerful effects, the rubber band will snap. There are just certain levels of power it won't be able to reach no matter what. That's the most ultimate truth. Take my dark ice force, for example. It's a fifth-dimensional force. Aina's brows jumped up when she heard that. She hadn't even thought about it before, but the moment Lionel mentioned dark ice force, things suddenly started falling into place. That was right. Some forces were considered to be of certain dimensions. And yet, higher dimensional individuals used them all the time. What did that mean? As a fifth-dimensional force, that should be its maximum output. I can't really apply more strength to it. However, I fuse my dark ice divine armor with an evolution ore, allowing it to display power comparable to the sixth dimension. Ironically, because of that, it's taken me longer than usual to realize the problem. My dark ice force is quasi-sixth dimensional thanks to evolution ore, my ethereal star force is seventh dimensional, my scarlet star force is ninth dimensional. I haven't reached the end of any one of those rubber bands yet, not even close for some, so I've never noticed the drop-off in power before, or even had to find a way to strengthen the rubber bands. Weapon forces are different, though. You notice the end of the rubber band almost immediately. You're forced to find a path ahead for it, because if you don't, it quickly becomes useless. Level by level, you're forced to push forward. I've honestly wondered why it is that everyone in the human domain uses a weapon force of some kind. Not everyone is destined to use a weapon, there have to be other paths. But the moment I step into this zone with such high-level attainments in force manipulation, I ran into the first and only mage I've ever run into outside of the Camelot zone. Of course, this mage Lionel was referring to was Aina's senior and a member of the Endless Twilight Pavilion. But I think I understand now. In our world, weapons are the only way to push past this bottleneck for people who aren't born with obscenely powerful affinities. Most won't have an innate node like mine, or even an affinity a step or two below. Even the very best lineage factors of the human domain are only seventh dimensional. My metal synergy lineage factor has an eighth dimensional door, but when I asked the dictionary about it, it triggered a video from my dad, and this is apparently a secret I have to keep no matter what. If you're in a world where the seventh dimension is almost a cap, then even in the Void Palace, the top-level geniuses usually, at best, control sixth-dimensional forces. When you combine that with the fact that humans haven't consolidated their talents and focused on one or two lineage factors across the board, it makes us even weaker. I don't think it's a coincidence that the strongest families in the human domain are the Morales and Seward families, who both have powerful weapon force lineage factors. That's where their advantage lies from the very beginning. Even the Archers' Alliance would be right there if not for what happened with the White Lion Bow. It's not because weapon forces are more powerful, it's because weapon forces are the only ones with an easy and logical progression toward the next step. In addition, there's a large number of masters one can pull inspiration from as well, whereas for other forces, it's not so streamlined at all. This should also be another reason why humans are so weak compared to the other races, and if I'm correct, this is indeed a mythological zone, but rather than displaying the use of a normal magic system, this one is a layer deeper than normal, displaying, instead, a universal method of manipulating and using forces of all kinds. I don't think the two of us are any less talented than chaos demons. What we lack are two things: foundation and force manipulation. The first can be fixed by absorbing refined demons. The latter, though, is more complicated. If this is a ubiquitous method of this zone, should have already run into methods in the previous exchange stores I visited, but I didn't. I also didn't find anything in the oligarch family's libraries either. It's likely that just like what I faced in the Camelot zone, there's only one method to get the true magic system of this zone. But since we've already failed this zone, that opportunity is gone. So there's only one option left. Aina looked down at Lionel, who was still on her lap. We have to figure it out ourselves. Lionel nodded. He wasn't feeling too terrible about this. Wasn't this what he was already doing with his spear force? He had seen enough examples by now to start figuring this out slowly. Lionel rose to his feet, feeling like he was brimming with power. Let's go to the highest level store before they boot us out of this world. Then we can leave this zone for good. Wait, Aina said for a moment before going to Thila's corpse. Without flinching, Aina shot a hand through Thila's chest and pulled out a bloody lump before handing it to Lionel. Lionel's brows shot up. In his hand, an emulation spatial force innate node Saturday. Chapter 1612. Published at 6th of February 2023 7:46 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1612. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1612. Absolute necessity. Lionel's heart skipped a beat when he saw what it was, but he also smiled bitterly inwardly. He hadn't even caught the faintest inkling that Thila had an innate node. This meant that against him, she couldn't even be bothered to use it. It seemed that even though it seemed as though she had been going all out, her pride since caused her to hold back somewhat, yet it was this very same Thila that was only ranked 13th and even ended up losing when she ganged up on the others with her two seniors. It was quite difficult to accept, even if this was a zone based on a fairy tale like Lionel speculated. In the end, Lionel sighed. Fusing with innate nodes is too much of a crapshoot. Even after decades, Miguel couldn't even use a fraction of mine properly. I doubt this innate node will be very helpful to me, Lionel said lightly. Still, it suits you far better than it does me. Anyone who tries to fuse with a Dream Force innate node like that one without the affinity would be asking to suffer. Lionel nodded lightly. That much was true. The only reason Miguel had even been able to make some use of his innate node was because he had high light and star force affinity to begin with, and he had the help of the bronze tablet to further help him and improve said light affinity. In addition, Miguel's ability index allowed him to devour and improve his affinities. So with innate light and star force affinity, he just needed to focus on improving his fire force affinity. By then, it wasn't impossible for him to make good use of Lionel's innate node. In fact, now that Lionel thought about it, Miguel's use of his Scarlet Star Force was actually still far beyond his own. According to what he knew, Miguel had spent a very long time at the peak of the 5th dimension. Since he had no other methods to improve, he focused everything on improving his lineage factor and studying his innate node. The result of that was quite magical. Even in the 5th dimension, he was able to kill the patriarch of the Viola, who had been nearing the peak of the 6th dimension with a single strike. This was something even the current Lionel wasn't entirely certain he could accomplish. Back then, Miguel hadn't even circulated Scarlet Star Force, he simply sent out a sword strike. In fact, it wasn't even in his strongest state. Back then, he had used his flexible sword, but his strongest weapon was a heavy sword. In addition, he hadn't revealed his white stone elephant lineage factor either. And yet, he was able to display so much strength. It was clear that Miguel's years of meditation on Lionel's innate node had yielded some excellent benefits. If not for Lionel taking his innate node and severing his path forward, it was hard to tell just how powerful Miguel would be now. Lionel sighed. He actually felt quite bad about that looking back. Back then, he was still furious about a number of things, so although he did see Miguel's perspective, he still didn't care to cater to it too much. It could be said that his mind was still in quite some disarray. No, I still am too immature. Lionel looked up into the skies, clutching the innate node. Lionel? Are you okay? Aina seemed to notice that something was off. Lionel looked toward Aina, his eyes softening and a sudden overwhelming feeling overcoming him. He reached out and grabbed her waist, pressing his lips to hers. Aina was taken aback, but still melted into Lionel's embrace. Maybe only the two of them could be so carefree amidst a litter of corpses, flesh and blood around them. When Lionel pulled back, Aina seemed to be out of breath, her gaze misty as she looked up at him. Her heart bloomed with happiness, feeling as though she was walking on air. "Let's leave this place," Lionel said lightly. Aina nodded. But quite frankly, it seemed that she would have nodded just the same even if Lionel's words had asked her to walk into the fiery pits of hell with him. Although they didn't exchange such words, it was clear that both of them had the resolve to follow the other to the ends of the earth. Lionel waved a hand and claimed Thila's spatial ring, finding a vial of blood within it. After a small procedure, he finally finished what he needed to and a portal appeared, transporting both himself and Aina away with a single step. Since the process was so elaborate to begin with, they didn't need to exchange any points at all. When their eyes cleared, the two found themselves in a room of white marble. White marble floors, ceiling, walls, and counters. There didn't seem to be anything in this space, but it only took a single sweep for Lionel to find several complex and hidden force arts. It seemed that this place worked similarly to how the odd space he had first met Uncle Montez in. If he wanted something, he would have to ask for it. Lionel's eyes narrowed, this made things more complicated. It would be easy to miss out on things like this, that would be unfortunate. He had already birthed a certain phobia of missing out on things ever since he stepped into the dimensional verse. However, with this thought in mind, Lionel's gaze only sharpened. With his mind working even faster, he wanted to see if there was really anything he would miss out on. He had enough points to rank in the top 10, and Aina had just killed 3 top 13 individuals. Between the two of them, they had more points than even first place by quite a large margin. There shouldn't be anything they wouldn't be able to exchange for. First, let's start with the absolute necessity. After that, we'll go through all the things we need one by one, and if we run out of demon points, we'll order them priority and only by the top of the list first. Lionel nodded to himself and spoke. Show me all of your 7th star spatial force ores with extremely stable chemical structures and sturdiness. Chapter 1613. Published at 6th of February 2023 7:46 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1613. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1613. First on the list. Lionel smiled when he saw the selections. The prices were better than he thought. Even the most expensive was a shade under $1 billion or so. Since his and Aina's wealth amounted to nearly $2 trillion, this could be considered chump change. Excellent. Lionel didn't need to pick the most powerful here, he just needed the one most compatible with his current materials. After picking out an ore that went by the name of Starlight Spatial Ward, a domain type or which was known for its defensive spatial abilities, Lionel nodded to himself. With this secured, their escape from this zone was guaranteed. It would all depend on him, but he didn't even consider for a single moment that he would fail. His calculations should be correct. Aina. Because we have to ask for the things we want to appear, it'll be easy to miss out on things if we aren't careful. And we also have a limited number of funds. Though the ore was inexpensive comparatively speaking, I doubt that things will remain like this. So let's test things one by one and make a list. Once we run out of ideas, we can order things based on priority and buy the things we really need first. Okay, I agree. Aina nodded. What do you need? Aina's gaze flickered. I have my hands full with the Blood Sovereign tablet. The methods and techniques within it are almost too numerous and I need to start from the very basics and work my way up. I have a feeling that the secrets of force manipulation you were talking about would be revealed step by step so long as impatient too, so I'm not very interested in techniques, or at least not supplemental techniques or ones that provide auxiliary boosts to power. If I were to choose techniques, they would be for my battle axe. Everything else is covered in the Blood Sovereign tablet. Also my body has a ridiculous amount of potential right now after it underwent that evolution. I even feel that my Abyssal Panther bloodline was purged. I can't sense it anymore, so I don't feel like I need Fiend class force pills either. What about your mental coercion? Lionel asked. That. Aina hesitated. I believe the Blood Sovereign tablet talks about it as well. In fact, half of the tablet is related to that. I see. Lionel nodded. It really did seem that Aina had all of her bases covered. And although she mentioned battle axe techniques, she didn't seem very interested in them either. Aina didn't seem to like to be restrained by techniques, and her fighting style was incredibly free-flowing. Lionel fell into his thoughts. It seemed that it would be difficult to find things that it would make sense to give Aina. In the past, he wanted her to take more advantage of her bloodline absorption abilities, but now that she had gained the body of a chaos demon, even that was no longer necessary. An innate node, maybe? Lionel suddenly asked. Aina raised an eyebrow. Is that even possible? Lionel laughed. Why not try? Show us your innate nodes. Lionel didn't actually expect much, but his breathing hitched in the next second. Just what kind of zone was this? Before him, an array of innate nodes appeared. While none of them were on the level of his Scarlet Star Force innate node, there was no doubt that each one would cause a war in the human domain. Innate nodes were so incredibly rare, how could they just casually appear here in such numbers? Soon, Lionel calmed. Things still weren't so exaggerated. There were a little under 24 of them, and even the best of them was only of 6-dimensional forces. Still, Lionel couldn't help but be shocked, especially since they were only about 10 billion demon points each. None of these were worth trading for Aina, and none were worthy of her level of talent, but this sudden change really shifted Lionel's perspective. This world, it could accomplish things he could even properly fathom. If it could manifest so many innate nodes for him to choose from, then just what kind of things could he exchange for here? This would absolutely change everything. It suddenly struck Lionel. If there were so many innate nodes here, then maybe. Show me your innate node incorporation methods. Lionel waited, staring daggers at the counters of marble, and just as expected, the lights began to flash one by one. They really do exist. Lionel whispered, turning his gaze to Aina. The two looked toward one another and smiled. It seemed that there were truly higher-level methods of fusing with innate nodes that existed. This meant that Thila's innate node wouldn't have to go to waste. In addition, if Lionel ran into any enemies with innate nodes in the future, he would be able to pass them along to his brothers and friends. The prices of these methods made Lionel's heart ache somewhat, though. While he didn't have to pick the most expensive of the others, when it came to techniques, the more expensive, the higher quality it was. In this case, the most expensive one here was just over 100 billion. That was already a 20th of Lionel and Aina's wealth if they traded for it. Lionel shook his head and added it to a mental list. In all likelihood, he would definitely have to buy such a thing. Thila's innate node was truly too compatible with him, but if he casually fused with it like Miguel had with his own, then it would end up becoming a hindrance instead of a help. It had to be remembered that while Miguel had been a step away from the 6th dimension for so long, the innate node within him was still 4th dimensional. This showed the problem with a poor fusion method. Alright, this can definitely be added to this list. What else? Lionel's gaze turned serious. Why don't you look for things that can help your tentacle womb and the golden-scaled koi fish to evolve? They're still too limited by their current strength. Hearing Aina's words, Lionel's gaze lit up. Chapter 1614. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:18 and 5 seconds AM. Chapter 1614. Gap. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Indeed. The abilities of the tentacle womb and the golden-scaled koi fish were astounding, but the limitations were too great. In order to garner real benefits from them, it would take decades, maybe even centuries of effort. If Lionel had the behemoth of the Morales family behind him, it would be easy to invest that kind of time. But if he wanted such a thing, he would first need to earn it, which would ironically require the help of the tentacle womb and golden-scaled koi fish to begin with. While Lionel was quite confident in his own power, the talent of the Morales family heirs wasn't to be looked down upon. Lionel felt that he should probably be able to contend with sector-ranked disciples now, but not all sector-ranked disciples were created equal, especially not sector-ranked disciples that were from the Morales family of all families. There was a reason the Morales family was considered to be maybe the strongest family of the human domain. To share both their lineage factors in one body was a testament to the fact you wielded great talent, and yet that was just the prerequisite to fight for the right to be an heir. In truth, had Lionel not improved his own strength so much, the gap might have been too large to even think of crossing. Now that he had, though, he finally stood a great chance. Even so, this was just the perspective of individual power. When it came to factions and backing, Lionel was even further behind than that. The majority of Lionel's brothers hadn't even been able to enter the Void Palace. His maternal family was a mere six-dimensional family, and the faction that he was still trying to build up with the Oryx and the Umbra family was still in an extremely fledgling state. The Oryx hadn't even really chosen to follow him yet, and he could only be considered to have the backing of one of their princes. And the Umbra family was far weaker than even the Luxniks, at least on the surface. It had to be remembered that the Umbra family was one that had broken away from the Three-Finger cult, and they had the first stage of the dark half of Lionel's lineage factor, the Shadowtail lineage factor. The power they had should mostly be hidden since they had managed to run from the Three-Finger cult, but this also meant that making use of them was a double-edged sword. To make matters worse, Lionel knew too little about how his cousins were faring. What was the depth of their strength? What trump cards did they hold? He didn't even really understand them. All he knew was that his first cousin, First Nova, had done him a favor by influencing the Void Senate. This meant that he had connections far loftier than Lionel could imagine. Then there was Fourth Nova, who had tied Aina to that contract. It seemed that Lionel had easily foiled him, but despite the fact Fourth Nova had had a year to make another move and did nothing, it made Lionel wonder if his true goal was really to poach away Aina at all. Lionel was right to worry about such things. There was still Second Nova, who had a ridiculously wide reconnaissance network that had managed to find out that Third Nova was scheming against the Unfettered Blade Party to deal with the stalwart Polearm Party. And yet Lionel hadn't even detected Second Nova even once, nor did any of them know what Third Nova had been planning that day when he forced Lionel's batch into the Rapak's nest. Each one seemed more mysterious than the last, and even if Lionel felt confident in at least defeating some of them in one-on-one combat, what good was that in an air war that tested one in all aspects? Not to mention the fact that even he wouldn't say that he could defeat them all. Then there was still Fifth and Sixth Nova on top of that. The Void Palace had very few records on the Morales family's air wars, at least not in any real detail. However, the things they had described made it clear that the name war was not chosen lightly. When the Morales Air Wars began, it would sweep up the whole human domain. Just take the Valiant Heart Mountain organization as an example. An organization so far away, and so many galaxies separated from the Morales family, had actually participated as well. When things were looked at like this, Lionel was so far behind that it was hard to put in just a few words. So when he heard what Aina said, he nodded immediately. Show me what you have to improve beasts. Lionel already had the silver tablet, so he had a shortcut to evolving the two of them. But he didn't allow this to cloud his judgment. He wanted to first understand what methods this world had so that he didn't bias the suggestions too much. But in choosing to do things this way, Lionel quickly realized that he had actually made his ask far too broad. There were too many things, and most of them didn't even have what he needed. Taking his time, Lionel asked question after question, narrowing down the lists before him and making adjustments based on what appeared. Eventually, he came to a few solutions. The first was that refined demons were a viable option here. Much like refined demon force pills helped him and Aina, they would also be able to help here as well. The second option was the beast crystals of like beasts. This was an excellent option as well, especially when paired with the silver tablet. Usually, absorbing beast crystals only came with a percentage chance of receiving the effects you wanted, but the silver tablet made it guaranteed. This was how Lionel was able to give Gil his Crimson Lightning. The third option was fascinating as well, and it was the most complex. However, if it worked, its benefits would be the greatest. And that was to allow the tentacle womb and golden-scaled koi fish to form star runes. Chapter 16:15. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:18 and 3 seconds AM Chapter 16:15. Formation. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The force manipulation abilities of this world had been at the forefront of Lionel's mind for a long while already, and he knew that if he wanted to reach the level of power he sought after, he would definitely have to grasp such abilities. Somehow, the further depth of comprehension one gained in this world, they seemed to be capable of displaying abilities further outside the realms their forces were usually constrained to. Lionel had a certain hypothesis, and he felt that it might be correct. Maybe the reason why it was possible to cross dimensional barriers to do battle at all was because his world hadn't grasped these abilities as they should. From the very beginning, Lionel had understood that dimensions weren't simple power levels. They were a qualitative change of being. A fourth-dimensional existence should be able to crush a third-dimensional existence no matter how talented the latter was. That was what science said. However, the likes of Lionel and Aina always seemed capable of breaking these rules. Lionel didn't really understand why this was until something clicked. Why was it that even when his mind was in the seventh dimension, everyone saw him as a sixth-dimensional existence? What about in the past when both his mind and body had entered the fourth dimension, and yet everyone still thought he was in the third dimension? Why was it that only when his internal force entered a new dimension, would he be seen as being at that level? When you asked this question, then you thought about Lionel's hypothesis, and then you connected that with the force manipulation abilities of this zone. Things began to slowly sink into place one by one. Force was the most important factor in one's strength, and the degree to which you could use it was what truly dictated what state of dimension you had reached. Regardless of how strong Lionel's mind or his body, all of the force he used was still firmly in the sixth dimension. Author's note: I think I forgot to write that Lionel recovered to the sixth dimension after absorbing the Cobra Demon, so just assume that happened. Forgive me, but when Lionel fought Thela and his mind worked slower than it should, or when he fought the Cobra Demon and his Scarlet Star force felt even weaker than normal third-dimensional fires, why was that? Well, if you thought about it, was that what true suppression between the dimensions should feel like? Wasn't that the despairing gap that should have always been there, and yet never had been? If it wasn't for the fact that Lionel was in the same dimension as Thela and the Cobra Demon, that despairing gap would have been even wider. It was only thanks to the fact that Lionel's soul separated from his body and thus the suppression the Cobra Demon could levy toward him that he was able to surpass such shackles. If he hadn't, he would have died. Well, he had died, actually. Upon realizing this, how could Lionel's thoughts not be constantly ruled by force manipulation and how to make use of it? And with Lionel's speed of thought, how could he not come up with countless potential hypotheses related to it? One of these hypotheses that he liked the most was that the secret to this force manipulation was tied to what this world valued the most: star runes. Lionel felt that his use and comprehension of star runes until this point was quite artificial and it hadn't provided him as much of a boost to his prowess as he thought it should. He had formed up to perfect seventh-dimensional star runes on his Dream Force stars, and yet his mind had still been suppressed by the likes of Thela and the Cobra Demon who had far weaker minds than his own. This made sense. Did he also have star runes in his innate node? In fact, he had ninth-dimensional star runes in one of them, but could he use them? Not at all. At best, Lionel could use his star runes to call down Scarlet Star Force and Dream Force of equivalent dimension, something that his stars were already capable of doing. Clearly, he was missing something extremely important. As such, he felt that there was a 91% probability that star runes held the secret that he was looking for. This confirms something I was thinking about, Lionel suddenly said. What's that? Lionel quickly explained his thoughts before continuing. The mantras should be a shortcut to understanding these secrets. Even though we can't get the full reward of this zone any longer, I think that if we stack up on these mantras, it'll only be a matter of time before we grasp the truth. Even with Lionel's Dream Force talent, he still needed the Dream Force mantra to form his star runes so quickly. If these mantras were able to focus the mind and aid in meditation to such an extent, it was likely that they were the key to connecting with star runes on a deeper, more meaningful level as well. Lionel already had the Dream Force mantra, and it only cost a few million demon points. Stacking up on a ton of mantras shouldn't be too expensive and should be quite easy. He could even get one of every kind so that when he passed down, dimensional cleanse, to everyone, they would be able to grasp these subtleties as well. It was just unfortunate that not everyone would be able to form 9 stars like he had, but he just had to take things one step at a time. Is it possible to teach to beasts, though? Aina asked. She hadn't forgotten that this was the main reason Lionel had gone down this rabbit hole. Yes, Lionel nodded. This force art right here, the Dream Star Gathering Beast Formation, should do the trick. It costs just under 100 billion demon points as well, but it allows me to set up a formation that places both myself and a target beast into a dreamlike state. Through that state, I can pass on the mantra or even cultivate it for them. Chapter 1616. Published at 20th of February 2023 8:18 and 1 AM. Chapter 1616. Sovereign. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 100 billion? That's quite steep. Can't you do the same thing with your connection with them? Aina asked. Every beast and master had a connection between them. This formation just seemed like an unnecessary step. In addition, they already likely had to allocate a 100 billion to the innate node fusion method, so they had to be cautious with what they spent the rest of their demon points on. There's a connection between beast and master, yes, but it's quite vague. For example, I can't understand exactly what Little Black Star is saying. I can only try to decipher it based on the emotions he's sending my way. Sending something as complicated as a mantra would be impossible. At the same time, the comprehension abilities of beasts are often based on their innate instincts. If I wanted them to learn a human-created technique like this one, it would be impossible. The only other way would be to have them naturally comprehend star runes on their own, but how could that be possible? Aina nodded slowly. Then what about the star runes themselves? How will they use star runes without stars? Will you teach them, dimensional cleanse, with this formation as well? No, I'm going to use a different method. According to this, it's possible to inscribe it directly onto their beast crystals. I just need to guide the process. Doing so will cause a qualitative change in their combat strength. Aina nodded again. She didn't really doubt Lionel, she just couldn't help but smile when he explained things. The path beasts took was inherently different from that of humans. For example, beasts were much more reliant on their ability indexes. Since we're on the topic of beasts, I should probably also try to find something that will help Little Black Star. He absorbed a Shadow Sovereign, so his ability index is much more powerful now than it was in the past, and before that he also absorbed Void Beast blood. The little guy is already very powerful because of that, so there's really not much to do outside of helping him inscribe some Darkness Star runes on his beast crystal. Maybe ask about Shadow Sovereign specifically, Aina said. Lionel nodded. That made sense. In fact, not that he thought about it, it would be good if they found out more about sovereigns in general. After asking and sifting through the items that appeared, Lionel was surprised to find that the root of sovereignty was actually in a domain. The shadow world of the shadow sovereigns, the spear domains of spear sovereigns, and blood domain of blood sovereigns. Being a sovereign meant having such an innate domain of your own, one that you could pull strength from whenever you wanted. Outside of this, though, the similarities between sovereigns mostly came to a stop and each had their own methods of improving and their own uniqueness. For example, Shadow Sovereign could absorb other Shadow Sovereigns. Blood Sovereigns could absorb blood to change their very constitution. Spear Sovereigns made all spears useless before them except in the face of another Spear Sovereign. The abilities were wide-ranging and they manifested in different ways. The only thing linking them was dominion over a certain domain. Lionel didn't end up finding anything Blackstar absolutely had to have, but he learned a lot more about this enigmatic sovereign title he kept hearing so much about before moving on. Wait. Lionel's gaze flashed. Show me materials related to making sovereigns. It was a shot in the dark, but Lionel felt that it was possible. If he was correct, the spear domain ring's real purpose was to create spear sovereigns. That was why that woman had mistaken him to be one. In addition, the abilities of a shadow sovereign seemed to be something you could pass along since they could be absorbed between them. Maybe if there was a catalyst, you could take the ability for yourself. Surprisingly, the shop really did have items of what Lionel needed. The first thing Lionel saw was a book called Path of the Spear. There were all sorts of books here named just like this but for different weapons as well. They were too expensive, just tens of millions of demon points. Lionel concluded from this that these books weren't rare, but considering the fact there weren't spear sovereigns running around everywhere, it obviously wasn't a simple task even if you had one. Just from their introduction, Lionel felt that they were far inferior to his spear domain heirloom in this respect. However, he still added them to the list because this systematic method of progression might contain secrets he could use to comprehend how to improve his other forces as well. In addition, they would help his brothers. Of course, he was also very interested in how to organically become a Daoist sovereign as well. If there was anyone who could do it, he felt like he should probably be at the top of the list. After another scan, Lionel realized that there was nothing here about becoming a blood sovereign. It seemed that it was likely impossible to do so without being born one, or at the very least, they didn't have such methods here or they weren't willing to sell them. It also seemed, unfortunately, that this was also the case for shadow sovereignty. From the looks of it, only weapon sovereigns could be created, but even then, you needed great talent and affinity for the weapon to begin with. Still, Lionel was satisfied with adding those books to the list. He had a feeling that their comprehensive explanation of the path of weapons would be far better than anything he could find elsewhere. Like this, about 201 billion points are allocated for what's already on the list, so that's 10% of our budget gone already. Lionel's eyes narrowed. There was nothing he could do about how quickly the funds were disappearing, he could only press forward and take what he could get. Show me everything you have related to Scarlet Star Force, Lionel said. The human class sector hadn't had anything like this, but maybe the fiend class sector would. If not, he would also check everything they had related to Emulation Spatial Force. Since he was already starting way behind in the force manipulation game, he had to try to learn as much as he could. When the counter flashed and the items began to appear, Lionel's brows rose slowly. You're tuning into the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.